I decided to surprise them and drove up to their house. Just as I reached for the door handle, their neighbor sprinted across the lawn and grabbed my wrist. He looked terrified and told me a secret that made my blood run cold. 5 minutes later, the police arrived. My name is Hollis. I am 69 years old, and I spent my life building a logistics empire from nothing. Before I tell you how I tore my own family apart to save my wife, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against those who underestimated your quiet strength. I parked my heavy-duty truck in the wide manicured driveway of Connor and Tanya's upscale suburban home. The neighborhood was painfully quiet, filled with identical, perfectly cut lawns and expensive luxury sedans. I stepped out into the crisp morning air holding a fresh bouquet of yellow roses, Brenda's absolute favorite flowers. I planned to knock on the heavy oak door, surprise my wife, and take her out for a nice afternoon lunch in the city. Before my boot could even touch the first brick step of their porch, a man sprinted across the adjacent yard. It was Stan, the neighbor from next door. I recognized him from a brief, polite introduction years ago at a neighborhood block party. He grabbed my wrist with a desperate, frantic grip. His eyes darted nervously toward Connor's large living room window before he spoke in a rushed, terrified whisper. He told me Brenda never arrived 2 weeks ago for a casual afternoon visit. According to Stan, a black, unmarked private ambulance backed into Connor's driveway at exactly 3 in the morning. 2 men wearing dark scrubs carried someone inside on a medical stretcher. Stan recognized my wife's face, illuminated under the harsh glare of the porch light. He swore to me he had been watching the house every single day since that moment and had not seen Brenda step foot outside once. The casual vacation story was a complete fabrication. My wife had been smuggled into her own daughter's home like a prisoner in the dead of night. My fingers opened abruptly. The beautiful bouquet of yellow roses dropped onto the hard concrete walkway petals, scattering across the gray stone. I shoved past Stan without a word and hammered my heavy fists against the solid oak front door. The thick wood rattled under the sheer force of my blows. I did not stop pounding until the deadbolt finally clicked open. Connor pulled the door ajar just enough to fill the gap with his broad frame. He wore a crisp linen shirt and a look of calculated, arrogant annoyance. He planted his feet firmly on the threshold, actively blocking my view of the long, brightly lit foyer inside. I demanded to see my wife immediately. Connor crossed his arms and lowered his voice into a deeply patronizing tone. He casually informed me that Brenda had suffered a severe nervous breakdown. He claimed she required absolute, uninterrupted isolation to recover, and that seeing me would trigger another violent emotional episode. I knew Brenda better than I knew my own heartbeat. She had absolutely no history of mental instability, no nervous breakdowns, and certainly no logical reason to be hidden away from her husband of over 40 years. Connor attempted to forcefully close the door in my face, telling me to go back home and wait for his call. I jammed my thick work boot against the door frame to stop it from shutting. Without wasting another breath on an arrogant liar, I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed 911. I reported a potential hostage situation involving a vulnerable senior citizen. Connor did not flinch or panic. He simply glared at me and locked his jaw tightly. The piercing wail of police sirens shattered the quiet suburban street shortly after my call. 2 uniformed patrol officers stepped out of their cruiser and jogged briskly up the driveway, hands resting near their utility belts. I expected them to bypass Connor, enter the house by force, and secure my wife's safety. I fully expected panic and fear from my deceitful son-in-law. Instead, Connor completely dropped his hostile defensive demeanor. He greeted the officers with a calm, highly cooperative smile. He stepped aside smoothly and politely invited them inside the house to assess the situation, deliberately leaving me standing alone on the cold brick porch. The heavy oak door shut in my face once again, locking me out of my own family's crisis. I paced the brick steps rapidly, my mind racing through every logistical possibility and legal loophole. 10 agonizing minutes passed in absolute suffocating silence. The front door finally reopened. The lead police officer walked out with a thick manila folder securely in his hands. His expression had shifted from alert suspicion to dry bureaucratic formality. He did not ask Connor to step outside for questioning. He did not demand that Brenda be brought to the door for a visual welfare check. The officer stopped directly in front of me and opened the folder. He handed me a crisp, professionally notarized document. It was a comprehensive medical power of attorney. The paperwork granted Connor absolute legal authority over Brenda's healthcare decisions, living arrangements, and communication access. At the very bottom of the final page, placed right next to a fresh notary stamp, was Brenda's signature. I stared intensely at the blue ink on the white page. The signature was incredibly sloppy, forced, and entirely uncharacteristic of my wife's historically neat handwriting. But the official notary stamp gave the document undeniable legal weight. The lead police officer took the paper back from my hands and closed the manila folder firmly. He looked me straight in the eye and delivered a strict, uncompromising warning. He stated clearly that Connor was acting completely well within his legal rights as the designated medical proxy. The officer then ordered me to step off the private property immediately. He made it crystal clear that if I refused to leave or if I dared to return without Connor's explicit permission, he would have absolutely no choice but to arrest me on the spot for criminal trespassing. I looked past the officer's broad shoulder into the house. Connor stood tall in the foyer, arms crossed over his chest, wearing a smug, triumphant smile. He truly believed his white-collar legal tricks had permanently defeated me. He thought he had successfully neutralized a tired, powerless old man. I did not yell in frustration. I did not curse at the police or attempt to throw a physical punch at Connor. I simply turned my back to the house and walked slowly down the driveway to my truck. Connor legally controlled my wife for now, but he fundamentally misunderstood exactly who he was dealing with. I climbed into the driver's seat, gripped the leather steering wheel tightly, and shifted the massive truck into gear. I did not panic or despair. I simply began calculating my ruthless invasion. I started the engine, letting the heavy diesel rumble echo through the pristine neighborhood. I put the truck in reverse and backed slowly down the driveway until I reached the edge of the street. I shifted into park and turned the engine off. I opened my door and stepped out onto the asphalt. I took 3 steps toward the property line before I suddenly clutched my chest with both hands. I dropped to my knees on the manicured grass, gasping heavily for air, and let my body collapse completely onto the lawn. I contorted my face into a mask of pure agony, dragging my fingernails through the dirt. My daughter Tanya rushed out of the front door in an absolute panic. She sprinted across the yard, her designer heels sinking into the soil, screaming my name. Connor appeared in the doorway a second later. His smug demeanor vanished, replaced instantly by furious, calculated dread. Fearing that a dead black man on his front lawn would immediately draw a massive public investigation and media attention, Connor angrily ordered Tanya to drag me inside the house. He rushed forward, grabbed me by the armpits, and forcefully hauled my heavy frame across the threshold. The door slammed shut behind us, isolating us from the neighborhood's prying eyes. The moment the deadbolt clicked into place, my agonizing gasps stopped completely. I planted my boots firmly on the hardwood floor and stood up straight, brushing the dirt off my jacket. Connor stepped back, his eyes widening as he realized he had been played. I ignored him entirely. My eyes locked onto the corner of the vast modern living room. Brenda sat slumped in a high-backed medical wheelchair. Her posture was unnaturally rigid. Her eyes were glassy, vacant, and completely unfocused. I rushed to her side and gripped her hands. They were freezing cold. I recognized the physical signs immediately. The sluggish breathing, the dilated pupils, the lack of motor response. She was under heavy chemical sedation. I turned my head and glared at my biological daughter. Tanya refused to look me in the eye. She crossed her arms tightly and stared down at the expensive rug beneath her feet. The daughter I had raised to be strong and independent was actively participating in the chemical imprisonment of her own mother. Connor stepped between Brenda and me, jabbing a finger directly at my chest. He threatened to call a psychiatric transport van immediately. He warned me that if I created a scene, he would use his legal authority to have me committed to a ward right alongside my wife. I looked at Connor's aggressive posture and swallowed my towering rage. A physical altercation would only give him the legal excuse he desperately needed to remove me by force. I slumped my shoulders forward, intentionally adopting the physical demeanor of a broken, exhausted old man. I told Connor that the shock of seeing Brenda in this condition had drained the last bit of energy from my heart. I insisted that I was too weak to drive my truck safely back to the city. I asked to simply rest on the living room sofa for the night before leaving peacefully in the morning. Connor debated throwing me out, but the fear of me collapsing on his lawn a second time forced his hand. He reluctantly agreed, warning me not to wander the house. He turned off the main lights and led Tanya upstairs to their master bedroom. I lay perfectly still on the leather sofa for 4 hours, listening to the absolute silence of the house. At exactly 2 in the morning, I stood up. I silently crept down the hallway, avoiding the floorboards I knew would creak. I slipped into Connor's home office and closed the door without a sound. I turned on a small pen light. I searched his desk drawers and filed through his trash bin. Near the bottom of the bin, I found an empty glass medical vial. The label identified a highly restricted, incredibly potent tranquilizer strictly prohibited for elderly patients without a hospital setting. I slipped the empty vial into my jacket pocket, securing the physical proof of his crime. I shifted my pen light back to the trash bin and lifted a crumpled stack of discarded papers. Beneath the medical waste, I found a pristine, heavily redacted legal draft. I flattened the document on the desk and read the bold heading. It was an ownership transfer deed. The paperwork systematically listed every single commercial logistics warehouse I had built over the last 40 years. The deed required my signature to surrender my entire empire directly into Connor's holding company. The puzzle pieces locked together instantly in my mind. They did not kidnap Brenda out of spite or malice. They were using my wife's life as leverage to steal my life's work. They planned to keep her sedated and trapped until I agreed to trade my multi-million-dollar business for her freedom. Connor had severely misjudged the man he was trying to extort. I folded the transfer deed and slid it into my pocket alongside the tranquilizer vial. I turned off my pen light and stepped back into the dark hallway. I did not intend to negotiate with terrorists, and I definitely did not intend to surrender a single brick of my legacy. I returned to the living room sofa and closed my eyes, preparing to completely dismantle Connor's life. Morning sunlight pierced the heavy living room curtains, stinging my eyes. I sat up from the leather sofa just as the front door chimed open. Connor walked in freshly showered, wearing a tailored navy suit. Trailing closely behind him was a man carrying a sleek leather medical bag. He introduced himself as Dr. Aris, a private concierge physician. I recognized the type immediately from my decades negotiating logistics contracts with corporate vultures. This man was not here to heal anyone. He was a hired gun. Connor stood near the fireplace, crossing his arms, a confident smirk playing on his lips. Dr. Aris sat in the armchair opposite me, clicking a silver pen. He did not check my pulse or look at my eyes. Instead, he immediately launched into a rapid-fire interrogation designed to insult and disorient me. He asked if I knew what year it was in a tone usually reserved for toddlers. He asked if I frequently forgot where I parked my truck, or if I experienced sudden, uncontrollable outbursts of violent rage toward my family. The strategy was glaringly obvious. Connor needed a documented psychiatric incident. If I raised my voice, if I threw a punch, or even if I simply refused to answer his degrading questions out of justified anger, Dr. Aris would instantly sign a 72-hour involuntary psychiatric hold. Connor would then have both me and Brenda legally locked away, leaving my entire commercial real estate empire completely defenseless against his fraudulent property transfer deed. I looked at Connor's smug face, waiting for me to snap. I took a slow, deep breath, burying my fury deep into the pit of my stomach. I decided to give them the exact opposite of what they wanted. I sat forward and rested my hands calmly on my knees. I looked directly into Dr. Aris's eyes and answered every single question with absolute monotonous precision. When he asked about my memory, I recited the exact square footage, geographic coordinates, and current property tax valuations of my 3 largest warehouse facilities in Chicago, Atlanta, and Dallas. When he probed for signs of emotional instability or paranoia, I spoke in a low, measured voice about my daily routine, outlining my cholesterol management and my pristine 30-year commercial driving record. I did not blink. I did not raise the volume of my voice a single decibel. I became a brick wall of pure, unshakable logic. After 20 minutes of relentless questioning, Dr. Aris stopped clicking his silver pen. He closed his leather notepad and let out a frustrated sigh. He turned to Connor and shook his head slightly. A private doctor can fabricate many things for the right price, but he cannot legally declare a sharp, hyper-lucid businessman legally incompetent while standing in a brightly lit living room. Doing so would risk his medical license if I ever challenged him in federal court. Connor's smug smile vanished completely. The veins in his neck bulged against his crisp collar. He aggressively gestured for Dr. Aris to follow him into the hallway, his pristine white-collar facade cracking under the pressure of his mounting hidden debts. I watched them step out of the room, leaving the door cracked open just enough for me to hear their hushed, furious argument. Connor demanded the doctor do what he was paid for. I did not waste this golden opportunity. My window of action was finally open. I moved swiftly and silently across the carpet. Brenda remained slumped in her wheelchair exactly where they had left her the night before. Her chest rose and fell in a shallow, unnatural rhythm. I knelt beside her and gently grasped her limp right hand. From the inner pocket of my jacket, I retrieved my personal diabetic testing kit. I manage my blood sugar daily, so carrying a sterile lancet is a permanent habit. Today, it was my primary weapon. I swiftly uncapped the tiny needle and pressed it firmly against the tip of Brenda's index finger. I pushed the trigger. Brenda did not flinch. She did not even blink. The heavy chemical chains binding her nervous system blocked out the pain entirely. A dark, thick drop of blood swelled on her fingertip. I pulled a sterile microvial from my kit, carefully scraping the edge against her skin to collect the sample. I sealed the vial tightly and slipped it deep into my pocket right next to Connor's fraudulent property transfer deed. I wiped her finger clean with an alcohol prep pad just as the hallway door swung wide open. Connor marched back into the living room, his face flushed with barely suppressed rage. Dr. Aris followed, looking thoroughly defeated, and quickly exited the front door without saying goodbye. Connor glared at me, realizing his attempt to institutionalize me had failed spectacularly. He demanded to know what I was doing near his mother-in-law. I stood up, slowly stretching my back, and gave him a polite, entirely hollow smile. I told him I was just saying a quick goodbye before getting out of his hair. He pointed to the door. I told Connor I needed to drive into town to grab a hot breakfast and a strong coffee before making the long trip back home. He did not object. He wanted me off his property immediately so he could figure out his next move. I walked out the front door, climbed into my heavy-duty truck, and drove straight past the local diners. I headed directly to an independent toxicology laboratory I occasionally use to screen commercial truck drivers for my logistics company. I slapped $500 in cash on the pristine glass counter and demanded an immediate expedited panel on the blood sample. I paced the sterile waiting room for 2 agonizing hours. The lab technician finally emerged and handed me the printed results. The paper confirmed my absolute worst fears. Brenda's blood was heavily saturated with a potent, illegal psychotropic cocktail specifically engineered to induce severe catatonia. It was a dangerous chemical straitjacket designed to perfectly mimic end-stage dementia. Armed with the irrefutable medical proof I needed to destroy Connor's medical power of attorney, I rushed back to my truck and sped toward the suburban neighborhood. I gripped the steering wheel, ready to tear the front door off its hinges and drag my wife out by force. I pulled into Connor's driveway. The front door was standing wide open. I sprinted inside, calling Brenda's name. Absolute silence answered me. I ran into the living room. The medical wheelchair was gone. I checked the kitchen, the guest room, and the master bedroom upstairs. Tanya's closet was half empty. Connor's desk was entirely cleared off. The house was completely deserted. Connor realized his plan was failing and had moved my wife. I stood alone in the center of the impeccably decorated living room. The heavy silence of the empty house pressed against my ears. Connor had realized his medical charade was falling apart and moved my wife before I could return with the toxicology report. Panic is a useless luxury I discarded decades ago on the commercial loading docks. I pulled out my phone and dialed Grover. Grover was not just an old friend. He was the chief forensic accountant who helped me build my logistics empire from a single rusty truck into a nationwide fleet. Back in the day, Grover could track a stolen shipping container moving through 3 different international ports using nothing but heavily encrypted customs manifests. Finding a leased European luxury SUV moving through local suburban streets was an elementary task for him. I gave Grover the license plate number of Connor's vehicle and told him to breach the onboard GPS navigation history. I did not need to explain the terrible urgency. Grover heard the absolute coldness in my voice and went to work immediately. The faint, rapid clacking of a mechanical keyboard echoed through the receiver as I paced the length of Connor's pristine hardwood floor. Minutes ticked by in total silence. I looked at the framed photographs lining the hallway, images of Connor and Tanya smiling on yachts, standing in front of ski resorts, and posing with expensive champagne mocked me. The glossy veneer of their perfect suburban life felt physically sickening to look at. Grover finally stopped typing. His voice came through the speaker, low and tightly coiled with genuine shock. He told me he had breached the vehicle's telemetry system successfully. He warned me that what he found was not just a simple location ping. The data he pulled revealed a completely catastrophic reality. Grover laid out the absolute devastation of my son-in-law's financial existence. Connor was not the brilliant tech entrepreneur he pretended to be at our family dinners. His entire investment firm was a rapidly collapsing shell game. Grover bypassed Connor's encrypted personal accounts and hit a massive wall of unregulated debt. Connor owed $3 million to a highly organized, extremely violent underground lending syndicate. The monthly interest alone was suffocating him. He had maxed out every line of credit, leveraged his luxury cars, and taken second mortgages on this very house. Grover found digital communication logs between Connor and Tanya discussing the impending ruin. My biological daughter was entirely aware of the crushing debt. Instead of walking away or seeking honest help, Tanya actively chose to maintain her illusion of high society wealth. She continued buying designer clothes and hosting lavish parties while violent enforcers circled their suburban fortress. They were desperate animals backed into a dangerous corner. Grover then intercepted a drafted email on Connor's server addressed to a syndicate lieutenant. Connor promised the criminals a massive infusion of collateral within the week. He explicitly listed the geographic coordinates of my 3 most profitable commercial warehouses. The entire timeline clicked into a horrific, crystal-clear picture. They drugged Brenda to force my hand. Connor intended to leverage my wife's freedom in exchange for the title deeds to my real estate. He planned to sign my life's work over to violent criminals to save his own skin. Tanya was fully willing to let her mother rot in a chemical prison just to keep her country club memberships. The betrayal ran far deeper than blood. I instructed Grover to isolate the final coordinates from the SUV's navigation system. The GPS data indicated that Connor had driven 40 miles outside the city limits deep into a heavily wooded, unincorporated county district. The address belonged to a remote, privately owned care facility. Grover quickly pulled the public records and tax filings for the establishment. It was an unlicensed cash-only operation completely off the grid of standard medical oversight. Facilities like this catered exclusively to wealthy clients who needed to stash problematic family members away from the prying eyes of state regulators and ethical medical boards. Grover hacked into the facility's rudimentary digital intake registry. He found Brenda's name listed under a highly restrictive, secure protocol. Connor had filed the fraudulent medical power of attorney with the facility director. He issued strict, uncompromising orders that absolutely no one was permitted to visit, call, or legally discharge the patient without his direct physical presence and notarized authorization. My wife was locked behind steel doors in an unregulated chemical ward guarded by mercenaries masquerading as healthcare professionals. If I simply drove up to the gates and demanded her release, the facility director would summon the local county sheriff. The police would enforce Connor's legal paperwork, resulting in my immediate arrest for trespassing and harassment. Connor had insulated himself behind layers of corrupt medicine and weaponized legal bureaucracy. He believed he had constructed an impenetrable fortress around my wife. He thought he had outsmarted a man who spent 40 years navigating the cutthroat, unforgiving world of commercial freight logistics. I stared out the living room window at the perfectly manicured street. The anger inside me solidified into a dense, unbreakable block of ice. I realized instantly that taking the standard legal route would be a fatal error. Filing an emergency injunction with a family court judge to contest the medical power of attorney would take weeks of bureaucratic maneuvering. Brenda did not have weeks. The heavy psychotropic drugs coursing through her veins would cause irreversible neurological damage long before a judge ever reviewed my petition. Connor held the ultimate hostage, and he held the legal high ground. The police could not help me bypass his authority fast enough to save her life. I needed to completely obliterate his leverage. I thanked Grover and ended the call. I walked out of that empty, deceitful house and climbed back into my truck. I did not drive toward the remote care facility, nor did I drive to the police station. I drove straight back to my own home to prepare a lethal financial trap. Connor was arrogant enough to believe that my love for Brenda would force me to surrender my assets blindly. He assumed I would panic fold under the pressure and sign away my empire just to see her again. I decided to give him exactly what he wanted. I would offer him the commercial real estate deeds on a silver platter. I would let him taste the salvation he desperately needed to pay off his syndicate handlers. But I would architect the surrender so flawlessly that the very moment he tried to use my wealth to escape his debt, the entire structure would collapse on his head. I was going to construct a paper trap so devious and legally toxic that it would destroy his only escape route and leave him completely at the mercy of the monsters he owed. I dialed Connor's number from the quiet, dimly lit cab of my truck, watching the morning traffic roll past. He answered on the first ring, his voice dripping with defensive arrogance and immediate suspicion. I did not match his aggressive tone. Instead, I let my voice crack heavily. I forced a slight tremble into my breathing, intentionally sounding breathless, exhausted, and entirely defeated. I told him I was done fighting his legal barricades. I told him my chest hurt constantly, my spirit was completely broken, and I just wanted to see my wife before I lost her forever to his chemical prison. I suggested a neutral public location to finalize our arrangement. I specifically picked a busy downtown coffee shop, a crowded place packed with civilian witnesses and security cameras to ensure he would not try anything physical or reckless. Connor agreed immediately, entirely unable to mask the eager predatory greed in his rapid response. He demanded I arrive alone and unarmed. I walked into the bustling coffee shop 20 minutes later. I physically transformed my posture before my boots even crossed the threshold. I rounded my broad shoulders, shortened my normally confident stride, and let my hands shake visibly as I pulled out a chair at a small corner table. I ordered a plain black coffee and stared blankly at the tabletop, projecting the perfect image of a man whose lifetime of strength had finally evaporated into nothing. Connor arrived shortly after, wearing a sharply tailored gray suit. He practically strutted across the cafe floor, dodging waitresses. He sat down opposite me without offering a greeting or a shred of basic human decency. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, looking at me with absolute contempt. He truly believed he was observing the total surrender of a logistics titan. He thought his imprisonment of Brenda had successfully broken my will. I let a long, heavy sigh escape my lips. I kept my eyes downcast, completely hiding the lethal calculation burning directly behind my retinas. I reached inside my battered leather jacket with slow, deliberate, agonizing movements. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder and laid it gently on the small cafe table between us. I pushed the folder across the smooth wooden surface until it physically touched Connor's fingertips. Inside were the comprehensive property deeds, tax records, and operating licenses for my 3 largest commercial logistics warehouses. These were prime, high-capacity industrial assets strategically located near major interstate highways. Their combined market value easily eclipsed Connor's massive underground syndicate debt twice over. I looked up at him with tired, red-rimmed, defeated eyes. I told him he could have all of it without a legal fight. Every single square foot of poured concrete, every loading dock, every active commercial shipping lease. I offered him immediate, uncontested ownership of my entire life's work. In exchange, I demanded 2 strict, non-negotiable conditions. He had to physically release Brenda back into my personal care today, and he had to legally sever the fraudulent medical power of attorney completely. Connor ripped the folder open. His eyes darted rapidly across the official property assessments and the enormous financial figures printed in bold black ink. His pupils dilated rapidly. The suffocating pressure of his $3 million mob debt vanished from his face, replaced instantly by naked, unchecked, venomous greed. He was staring directly at his literal salvation. A smart businessman would have intensely questioned why I surrendered my empire so easily. A cautious man would have scrutinized the sudden total capitulation of a hardened logistics boss. Connor was neither smart nor cautious. He was a desperate, drowning animal blindly grasping at a golden life preserver. He snapped the folder shut and leaned forward, bracing his elbows aggressively on the table. He gave me a cold, predatory smile and accepted the terms without a single second of hesitation. He told me I was making a very smart decision for Brenda's long-term health. Connor did not want to waste a single second of his perceived victory. He immediately pulled out his expensive smartphone and dialed his private corporate attorney. He aggressively ordered the man to drop whatever he was currently doing, draft a standardized memorandum of transfer, and rush down to the downtown coffee shop immediately. He wanted the property transfer legally binding before I had any opportunity to gather my strength and change my mind. We sat in agonizing silence for 30 minutes. I meticulously maintained my slouched, defeated posture while Connor nervously checked his luxury watch every 5 minutes, tapping his leather shoes against the floorboards. The lawyer finally arrived, visibly out of breath, carrying a sleek black leather briefcase. He produced the freshly printed legal documents and placed them on the table alongside a heavy silver pen. He briefly and dryly explained the binding nature of the agreement, verifying that my signature would instantly transfer all controlling interests of the designated commercial real estate directly into Connor's corporate holding company. I did not read the fine print. I did not ask for any legal clarifications. I simply picked up the heavy silver pen with an intentionally trembling hand. I hovered the tip over the signature line for a brief, agonizing moment, putting on a final dramatic display of profound hesitation and defeat. Then I pressed the ink to the paper. I signed all 3 copies of the transfer agreement right there in the crowded coffee shop. Connor snatched the papers from the table the absolute second the pen lifted from the final page. He did not even bother to thank me. He handed 1 copy to his confused lawyer and shoved the remaining documents forcefully into his custom briefcase. He stood up, towering over the small table, his chest puffed out with arrogant victory. He looked down at me and casually stated that he would arrange for Brenda's transport back to my house by the end of the week. Connor turned his back on me and practically ran out of the busy coffee shop, already barking rapid, commanding orders into his cell phone. He was actively calling his dangerous syndicate contacts, frantically arranging an emergency sit-down meeting to secure an immediate loan extension. He fully planned to walk into a room full of violent, unforgiving criminals and slam my commercial warehouse deeds onto their table as hard, undeniable collateral. He was so completely blinded by his own impending salvation that he failed to notice the fatal flaw currently resting inside his briefcase. I watched through the glass window as he climbed into his luxury SUV and sped away down the busy downtown street, cutting off a delivery truck. I sat back in my chair and took a slow, measured sip of my black coffee. My posture straightened completely. The manufactured tremble in my hands disappeared instantly, replaced by steady, cold control. Connor genuinely thought he had successfully extorted a helpless, terrified old man. He did not realize I had intentionally used an invalid, heavily modified variation of my legal signature. The name I scribbled onto his memorandum of transfer did not match the official signature registered with the state my banks or the county property clerks. The document he currently held like an impenetrable shield was completely worthless. It held absolutely zero legal weight in any court or financial institution. Connor was driving straight into a den of ruthless underground enforcers armed with nothing but a fraudulent piece of paper. He had promised them millions, and he was about to deliver them a legally void forgery. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed Grover. I told my forensic accountant that the bait had been taken perfectly. The paper trap was fully set and the timer was actively counting down. Connor had exactly 48 hours before the syndicate discovered his collateral was a total lie. The brutal financial execution was finally in motion. I knew exactly where Tanya would be at 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. I pulled my heavy-duty truck into the sprawling parking lot of the high-end organic supermarket located on the most affluent side of town. I parked 2 spaces down from her pristine white luxury SUV and waited patiently with the engine running. 10 minutes later, she walked out of the sliding glass doors pushing a cart loaded with overpriced imported groceries. She wore oversized designer sunglasses and carried a handbag that cost more than my very first delivery truck. I stepped out of my cab and physically blocked her path. She stopped abruptly, her manicured hands gripping the handle of her cart so tightly her knuckles turned white. She glanced around nervously, terrified that her wealthy neighbors might see her associating with the old man her husband had just legally defeated. I did not raise my voice. I did not scold her. I pulled a folded sheet of heavy paper from my inside jacket pocket and held it out to her. It was the official stamped toxicology report from the independent medical laboratory. I told her exactly what the highlighted numbers meant. I explained in cold clinical detail the lethal cocktail of illegal psychotropic drugs Connor was actively forcing into her mother's veins to induce a fake catatonic state. I told her this was her absolute final opportunity to step away from Connor's sinking ship and save her own soul. All she had to do was get in my truck right now, take me to the hidden care facility, and help me bring Brenda home safely. I looked at the daughter I had raised from birth and waited for absolute horror to wash over her face. I waited for the natural maternal bond to finally shatter her fake suburban illusion. Tanya took the official laboratory document from my outstretched hand. She pushed her dark designer sunglasses up into her hair and scanned the undeniable medical evidence of her mother's chemical imprisonment. She did not gasp. She did not drop her expensive handbag in shock. She read the toxic chemical breakdown with a completely blank, hardened expression. Then she deliberately pinched the top of the paper with both hands and slowly tore the toxicology report directly in half. She dropped the shredded evidence into the nearest concrete trash can. She looked me straight in the eye and delivered her justification with chilling clarity. She stated that Connor provided her with a level of elite social status, extreme comfort, and vast financial security that she could never possibly achieve on her own. She told me she refused to go back to being the daughter of a blue-collar warehouse manager. She aggressively pointed her finger at my chest, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of daughterly affection. She demanded I stop interfering with Connor's legal authority and simply hand over my commercial real estate assets as Connor requested. She insisted that my lifetime of hard labor was meant to serve her ultimate happiness anyway. She claimed my money was the only viable way they could clear Connor's massive hidden syndicate debts and maintain their flawless country club lifestyle without facing utter public ruin. She actually believed she was the victim in this scenario. She demanded I sacrifice her mother's sanity and my entire commercial logistics empire just so she could continue buying imported groceries and driving luxury cars. The sheer magnitude of her greed was suffocating. She stood beside her loaded shopping cart waiting for me to apologize and surrender to her demands. Tanya had made her ultimate choice, prioritizing a fake white picket fence life over her own mother's fundamental safety and sanity. The toxic rot of Connor's manipulation had not just infected her mind, it had completely consumed her entire soul. The vibrant, compassionate little girl who used to ride beside me in the cab of my first delivery truck was entirely dead and gone. The woman standing before me in the sunlit supermarket parking lot was nothing but a hollow, greedy parasite. I did not argue with her twisted logic. I did not waste my breath trying to appeal to a conscience that clearly no longer existed. I turned my back on her and walked silently toward my heavy-duty truck. I opened the heavy metal door and climbed up into the driver's seat. I rolled the window down exactly 2 inches. Tanya stepped forward, resting her perfectly manicured hand on the edge of my doorframe. She wore a confident, expectant smirk, assuming my silence signaled my ultimate defeat and compliance. She genuinely believed I was driving straight to the bank to finalize the transfer of my commercial warehouses to Connor. I reached down and firmly pressed the automatic lock button. The heavy locking mechanism clicked loudly, violently, snapping her hand back from the metal frame. I stared out the cracked window directly into her eyes. My gaze was completely dead-stripped of all paternal warmth and historical affection. I spoke with a quiet, lethal finality. I told her she was no longer my child. I stated that she had permanently severed our bloodline the exact moment she tore that laboratory paper in half. Her confident smirk vanished, replaced by a sudden flash of profound, disorienting confusion. I rolled the truck window up, completely severing our connection behind a thick pane of tinted glass. I shifted the heavy vehicle into gear and drove steadily out of the affluent supermarket parking lot. I did not look back in the rearview mirror. I left Tanya standing completely alone beside her cart of expensive groceries, staring blankly at my departing taillights as the harsh reality of my final words began to slowly sink in. She had chosen her side in this war, and I was going to let her burn right alongside the criminal she married. I merged onto the busy city expressway and pulled my cell phone from the center console. I dialed Grover's secure encrypted line. My forensic accountant answered on the very first ring, his fingers already rapidly clicking away at his mechanical keyboard in the background. He asked for my operational status. I did not hesitate. The time for gathering evidence and attempting peaceful diplomatic resolutions was officially over. Connor and Tanya had forced my hand by choosing chemical violence and pure extortion. I issued a single, uncompromising command into the receiver. I told Grover to initiate the full purge. I ordered him to activate every single financial tripwire, legal landmine, and digital trap we had meticulously constructed over the past 72 hours. I wanted Connor's fraudulent loan applications exposed, his illegal offshore accounts frozen, and his syndicate debt explicitly highlighted. Grover confirmed the directive with a grim tone and immediately terminated the connection. The ruthless reclamation of my wife, my hard-earned logistics empire, and my absolute peace of mind had officially begun. Connor was about to discover the true cost of stealing from a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Friday evening descended on the city, bringing a sharp, biting chill. Connor and Tanya completely ignored the dropping temperature, stepping out of a hired limousine at the entrance of a prestigious downtown art museum. They were attending a highly exclusive black-tie charity gala. Tanya wore a shimmering designer gown purchased just hours earlier on a maxed-out credit card, fully convinced their financial nightmare was permanently over. Connor confidently adjusted his silk bow tie, basking in the arrogant belief that the warehouse deeds safely tucked in his lawyer's briefcase had successfully secured his syndicate loan extension. He thought he had outsmarted a titan. He thought his mother-in-law was safely locked away forever. He was celebrating a victory that did not actually exist. 40 miles away, hidden in the shadows of an abandoned strip mall parking lot, I stood beside a massive idling transport van. I did not wear a tuxedo. I wore heavy work boots and a thick utility jacket. Grover had spared absolutely no expense. He had successfully contracted a highly specialized, fiercely discreet private tactical medical team. 4 men stepped out of the transport van wearing dark, unmarked tactical gear and carrying heavy trauma kits. These men were former combat medics professionals who asked 0 questions and operated strictly on cash retainers. The lead medic, a man with cold, calculating eyes, approached me and confirmed their medical extraction gear was fully prepped. I handed him the printed toxicology report detailing the exact chemical restraints currently binding Brenda's nervous system. He reviewed the chemical compounds, nodded sharply, and signaled his men to mount up. Connor was busy sipping imported champagne and shaking hands with the city's elite. I climbed into the passenger seat of the transport van, ready to rip my wife out of his illegal cage. The transport van tore down the dark, winding country roads, its headlights cutting through the dense forests surrounding the unlicensed care facility. We bypassed the main gate completely. The tactical driver expertly maneuvered the heavy van up a service access road, parking directly against the rear loading doors of the compound. We did not knock. The medical team breached the secondary entrance with a specialized magnetic lock bypass device, slipping into the sterile fluorescent-lit hallway in total silence. I marched directly toward the administrative wing, my heavy boots thudding loudly against the linoleum floor. The sudden noise immediately drew the facility director out of his office. He was a tall, nervous man wearing a wrinkled lab coat. He immediately stepped into my path, raising his hands and aggressively demanding we vacate the premises. He loudly cited Connor's medical power of attorney and threatened to trigger the silent alarm. I did not slow my pace. I stepped directly into his personal space, forcing him to back up against the corridor wall. I pulled a thick, tightly bound dossier from my jacket and slammed it squarely against his chest. Grover had compiled a devastating, irrefutable paper trail. The dossier contained undeniable proof that this specific director systematically accepted massive, untraceable cash bribes to hold vulnerable patients against their will. I spoke in a low, completely lethal whisper. I promised him that if he did not step aside immediately, I would electronically transmit every single page of that dossier directly to the Federal Health Board, the State Medical Licensing Committee, and the local district attorney. I gave him exactly 3 seconds to choose between stepping aside or spending the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The color instantly drained from his terrified face. The terrified director practically dropped the blackmail dossier onto the floor. His hands shook violently as he reached onto his belt and unclipped a heavy ring of master security keys. He did not utter a single word of protest. He quickly swiped his personal keycard against the electronic scanner, securing the restricted ward, and manually unlocked the reinforced steel door. I shoved him aside and stormed into the dimly lit corridor. The tactical medical team fanned out immediately, rapidly checking room numbers against the facility registry. The lead medic aggressively kicked open the third door on the right. I rushed into the dark, windowless room. Brenda was lying on a narrow institutional cot wrapped in a thin blanket. The chemical cocktail had kept her entirely immobilized. Her breathing was dangerously shallow, her face pale, and her eyes were squeezed shut in a drug-induced stupor. I placed my hand gently on her cold cheek, whispering that she was finally going home. The medical team moved with breathtaking efficiency. They did not waste a second. 2 medics smoothly transferred Brenda from the cot onto a portable, collapsible tactical stretcher. The lead medic immediately secured an intravenous line, injecting a specialized counteragent designed to slowly, safely neutralize the heavy tranquilizers Connor had forced into her system. They strapped her in tightly and rolled the stretcher out of the room at a rapid, highly coordinated pace. The facility staff watched in stunned, absolute silence as we bypassed the administrative wing and exited through the rear loading doors. The medics loaded Brenda's stretcher securely into the back of the transport van, locking the heavy rear doors shut. I climbed into the front seat. The driver slammed the heavy accelerator pedal down hard, leaving the completely corrupt facility shrinking rapidly in our rearview mirror. We completely abandoned the rural county roads and sped directly toward a private, highly secure hospital located in a neighboring state. Grover had already completely fabricated a flawless digital identity for my wife. The receiving medical staff processed her rapid admission under an entirely fake name, burying her presence deep inside a classified VIP recovery ward. Connor's fraudulent legal paperwork was completely useless across state lines, especially against an alias he did not know existed. I sat in the sterile hospital room holding Brenda's hand as color slowly returned to her cheeks. She was safe, heavily guarded, and entirely out of their reach. Back in the city, the high society charity gala finally concluded. Connor and Tanya rode back to their suburban mansion in their rented limousine, completely exhausted but practically glowing with unearned arrogance. They walked through their heavy oak front door, tossing their expensive coats onto the foyer bench. Tanya headed straight to the kitchen to pour a nightcap, cheerfully discussing the luxury vacations they would book once the warehouse money cleared. Connor confidently poured himself a large glass of expensive scotch. He pulled his smartphone from his tuxedo pocket to check his messages, fully expecting a confirmation email from his underground syndicate handlers acknowledging the property transfer. Instead, he found an urgent, frantic voicemail from the corrupt care facility director. Connor pressed the phone to his ear. The director's terrified voice blared through the small speaker, frantically explaining the armed medical raid, the blackmail dossier, and the absolute loss of their chemical hostage. Connor's face quickly contorted in sheer, absolute horror. His fingers went completely numb. The heavy crystal glass slipped directly through his grip, shattering violently against the hardwood floor. The expensive whiskey splashed across his polished leather shoes. Brenda was gone. Connor did not bother changing out of his expensive tuxedo. He kicked the shattered crystal glass aside and sprinted to his luxury SUV, leaving Tanya crying hysterically in the foyer. He ignored every speed limit on the dark highway, gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. He needed Brenda back immediately to finalize his leverage. Without her, the underground syndicate would violently collect his outstanding $3 million debt by morning. Connor dialed the local police precinct while tearing through the city streets. He utilized his polished corporate voice to fabricate a frantic, utterly convincing lie. He claimed his unstable father-in-law had violently abducted his severely ill wife from a secure medical facility. He arrived at my quiet suburban neighborhood and slammed his heavy vehicle into park directly across my front lawn. 2 police cruisers converged on my property mere seconds later, their flashing blue and red lights aggressively illuminating the quiet street. Connor jumped out of his vehicle and marched toward the patrol cars, demanding immediate, overwhelming action. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my front door, ordering the uniformed officers to breach the property and recover his stolen patient. He aggressively waved his fraudulently obtained medical power of attorney in their faces, loudly citing his absolute legal proxy status. He demanded a full tactical sweep of my premises to locate Brenda immediately. The officers drew their heavy flashlights and approached my porch with cautious, synchronized steps. They fully expected to encounter a barricaded, highly unstable kidnapper holding an elderly woman against her will. Connor stood safely behind them, crossing his arms over his tailored suit. He completely believed his weaponized bureaucracy would successfully rip my wife right back out of my protective custody. He thought he commanded the ultimate legal authority. I did not hide behind locked doors or cower in the dark. I swung my heavy front door open before the officers could even knock. I stood casually on my porch, dressed in comfortable clothes, holding a steaming mug of black coffee. I did not look frantic, unstable, or violent. I took a slow sip of my dark roast and offered the thoroughly confused officers a polite, welcoming nod. They immediately lowered their heavy flashlights, visually disarmed by the absolute tranquility radiating from my posture. Connor pushed his way past the officers' screaming demands and waving his medical proxy document wildly in the crisp night air. He ordered them to arrest me and retrieve Brenda. I ignored his frantic barking entirely. I reached into my back pocket and retrieved a thick, professionally bound legal envelope. I handed it directly to the lead police officer without raising my voice a single decibel. The officer opened the envelope and scanned the crisp legal stationery. It was a brand new, federally mandated emergency restraining order. Grover had relentlessly utilized his vast judicial connections to secure the document from a sympathetic night court judge merely hours ago. The judge had meticulously reviewed the irrefutable toxicology report proving Connor was actively poisoning my wife with highly restricted psychotropic drugs. The resulting court order was ironclad, absolute, and utterly unforgiving. It completely shielded Brenda and myself from any further physical or digital contact with my unhinged son-in-law. The lead officer read the staggering legal document twice over his rigid posture, shifting rapidly from cautious engagement to aggressive, highly focused authority. He handed Connor's useless medical proxy paperwork back without a single word of apology. He looked at Connor with deeply narrowed, highly suspicious eyes. The entire balance of power shifted immediately and completely tonight. The lead officer firmly tapped his finger against the judicial seal embossed on the restraining order. He loudly informed Connor that this federal injunction completely and permanently revoked his previously granted medical power of attorney. Connor's entire legal shield shattered instantly upon the concrete porch. He was no longer Brenda's authorized proxy. He was officially designated as a highly dangerous, violent threat to her physical safety. The second patrol officer immediately unclipped his heavy radio, actively requesting backup and specialized detectives to our location. The police turned their undivided attention away from me and focused entirely on the sweating, panicked man in the wrinkled tuxedo. The lead officer stepped aggressively toward Connor, placing his hand firmly on his heavy leather utility belt. He read aloud the specific poisoning allegations meticulously detailed in Grover's court filing. He demanded to know exactly why a pristine toxicology report showed astronomical levels of illegal catatonic tranquilizers actively coursing through Brenda's veins while she was exclusively under Connor's direct, isolated medical supervision. Connor stumbled backward, his polished arrogance evaporating into pure, unfiltered terror. He stammered incoherently, frantically attempting to deny the irrefutable laboratory evidence. He wildly accused me of fabricating the blood test and bribing the night court judge. The officers did not buy a single syllable of his desperate, chaotic performance. They ordered him to place his trembling hands where they could clearly see them. They aggressively questioned his exact involvement in the unlawful chemical imprisonment of my wife. Connor's chest heaved with shallow, erratic breaths as the walls of his fraudulent empire closed in around him rapidly. He realized with absolute, horrifying clarity that he was mere seconds away from being placed in steel handcuffs and shoved into the back of a police cruiser for attempted felony murder right away this very night. The lead officer forcefully ordered Connor to vacate my property immediately or face a direct violent arrest for violating the newly mandated federal restraining order. The police completely boxed him out, positioning their bodies between his sweating frame and my open front door. Connor backed away, his polished leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the damp suburban grass. He raised his hands in a pathetic, shaking gesture of complete surrender. He realized with crushing, absolute despair that his ultimate leverage was permanently gone. Brenda was safe inside my heavily protected custody, completely unreachable and chemically detoxing. He no longer possessed the human collateral required to legally force my hand. He retreated to his luxury SUV, his chest tightening with sheer panic. The flashing police lights cast harsh red shadows across his terrified face. The underground syndicate deadline was ticking down rapidly in his racing mind. They wanted their $3 million by morning, and they would not hesitate to brutally collect his life if he arrived empty-handed. Sweating profusely, he reached frantically into his passenger seat and aggressively gripped his custom leather briefcase. Inside sat the physical memorandum of transfer Y had signed back at the downtown coffee shop. He still completely believed those papers granted him total ownership of my massive commercial logistics empire. He foolishly assumed he still held the incredibly lucrative real estate assets required to satisfy his violent creditors. Connor slammed his heavy vehicle into drive, spinning his expensive tires against the pavement. He raced furiously toward his primary corporate bank, desperate to leverage the freshly acquired warehouse deeds into an immediate cash loan before his absolute final deadline expired. He remained entirely oblivious to the lethal, legally void forgery waiting patiently inside his briefcase. My financial trap was completely flawless, final, and perfectly set tonight. Connor slammed his SUV into a restricted parking zone outside the towering glass facade of his primary corporate bank. He ignored the valet and sprinted through the revolving doors, his tuxedo completely ruined by spilled whiskey and frantic sweat. He bypassed the standard teller lines and marched directly toward the frosted glass office of the senior wealth manager. He shoved the heavy glass door open without knocking, interrupting a scheduled conference call. The manager, a sharply dressed man named Sterling, blinked in shock at Connor's erratic appearance. Connor did not apologize. He collapsed into the leather guest chair, gasping for air, and slammed his custom briefcase onto the polished mahogany desk. He popped the latches, pulled out the memorandum of transfer, and slid the crisp documents across the smooth surface. He demanded an immediate, highly leveraged cash line of credit against the commercial warehouse deeds detailed in the paperwork. He aggressively insisted on a multi-million-dollar wire transfer to cover his outstanding syndicate debts by the end of the business day. He leaned back, wiping his damp forehead with his sleeve, absolutely certain he had just secured his salvation. Sterling adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and picked up the documents. He recognized the immense valuation of the logistics assets listed. He offered a tight, professional smile and turned to his dual monitors. The quiet clicking of his mechanical keyboard echoed through the pristine office as he accessed the state property registry and the bank's internal verification database. Connor watched the screen reflections bouncing off Sterling's glasses. He tapped his foot impatiently against the carpet, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. He felt the suffocating pressure beginning to lift, wholly convinced the nightmare was finally concluding. The rhythmic clicking of the keyboard stopped abruptly. A heavy, suffocating silence descended over the polished office. Sterling stared at his primary monitor for a long, agonizing moment before slowly pushing the memorandum of transfer back across the mahogany desk. He removed his glasses, his professional smile entirely gone. He informed Connor that the bank could not authorize a single dollar of credit against the provided documents. Connor bolted upright, slamming his hands onto the desk, demanding an immediate explanation for the delay. Sterling calmly explained the catastrophic reality. The signature inked at the bottom of the transfer agreement flagged an immediate critical failure in the automated verification system. It completely lacked the registered legal contours of Hollis's authorized signature. Furthermore, Sterling had pulled the county tax records to manually verify the asset chain. He revealed that Hollis did not personally own a single square foot of those commercial warehouses. Over 10 years ago, Hollis had meticulously transferred his entire real estate portfolio, all operating licenses, and every active shipping lease into an impenetrable, irrevocable blind trust. The legal entity required a unanimous board vote and a heavily vetted notarized release to transfer any assets. A simple signature on a coffee shop napkin meant absolutely nothing. The memorandum of transfer Connor held was not just legally void, it was practically a cartoon forgery. It possessed zero monetary value. Connor stared at the rejected paperwork, his mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. The impenetrable fortress he thought he had successfully breached was actually a hollow decoy. Hollis had played him with absolute flawless precision. Connor was standing at the edge of a financial cliff holding a worthless piece of paper. Connor stumbled backward, his legs suddenly weak and uncoordinated. He blindly grabbed the rejected memorandum of transfer, crumpling the heavy paper in his shaking fists. He did not say another word to the wealth manager. He turned and practically ran out of the glass office, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. He burst through the bank's revolving doors and hit the concrete sidewalk, the bright morning sun searing his exhausted eyes. The busy downtown street spun wildly around him. His flawless corporate facade had entirely disintegrated. He was no longer a wealthy tech entrepreneur or a ruthless manipulator. He was a bankrupt, completely exposed fraud with zero leverage and zero protection. As he reached the door of his illegally parked SUV, his cell phone vibrated violently inside his tuxedo jacket. The custom ringtone sliced through the ambient city noise like a physical blade. He recognized the encrypted caller ID instantly. It was the central lieutenant of the underground lending syndicate. Connor's stomach bottomed out. He leaned heavily against his vehicle, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the phone onto the pavement. He swiped the screen and lifted the device to his ear, desperately trying to steady his ragged breathing. The voice on the other end was quiet, methodical, and completely devoid of human empathy. The lieutenant did not ask about Brenda or the property transfer. He simply stated a terrifying financial fact. The syndicate had approved a massive high-risk advance loan just last week, strictly based on Connor's arrogant promise of securing those prime commercial warehouse deeds. They had floated him millions in untraceable cash to keep his shell company afloat, operating under the absolute guarantee of hard real estate collateral. The syndicate lieutenant let the silence stretch, forcing Connor to absorb the lethal gravity of his situation. He calmly informed Connor that the grace period for the advance loan had officially expired. They had tracked his vehicle to the bank and expected the immediate full electronic transfer of the promised funds. Connor's voice cracked violently as he attempted to form an excuse. He stammered out a pathetic lie about a temporary bureaucratic delay with the county clerk begging for just a few more days to finalize the paperwork. The lieutenant cut him off with a single sharp word. There would be no more extensions, no more fake corporate excuses, and no more borrowed time. The syndicate knew exactly who Connor was and exactly what he had done. They demanded the entire $3 million balance, plus the exorbitant accumulated interest delivered in clean, untraceable currency. The lieutenant delivered the final uncompromising ultimatum with chilling precision. They gave Connor exactly 48 hours to produce the cash in full. If the digital accounts were not completely satisfied by midnight on Sunday, they would stop asking for his money and simply collect his life instead. They promised a brutal, highly visible execution that would send a clear message to any other borrower thinking about defrauding their organization. The line went dead with a sharp click. Connor stood frozen on the busy sidewalk, the dial tone buzzing in his ear. The absolute reality of his impending death crashed down upon him. He had no warehouses, no wife to extort, and no access to banking credit. He was completely cornered, trapped in a rapidly shrinking box of his own arrogant design, with lethal predators actively closing in from every side. Connor practically tore the steering wheel from the steering column as he navigated his luxury SUV back to his sprawling suburban estate. He ignored the speed limits, completely driven by a primal blinding fear of the syndicate's 48-hour death sentence. He slammed the heavy front door behind him, completely ignoring Tanya, who was still weeping on the living room sofa. He sprinted up the grand sweeping staircase and locked himself inside his pristine mahogany-paneled home office. His hands shook violently as he tore open the bottom drawer of his custom desk. Weeks ago, during his initial campaign to medically isolate Brenda, he had methodically photocopied every single piece of my sensitive personal identification. He spread the stolen documents across his immaculate desk. He possessed pristine digital copies of my driver's license, my social security card, my birth certificate, and my clean, untarnished commercial tax returns. The syndicate needed $3 million, but Connor knew he could not generate that amount of liquid cash instantly without triggering massive federal red flags. He needed an immediate, untraceable stopgap to appease the lieutenants and buy himself another week to flee the country entirely. He booted up his encrypted laptop and bypassed the standard retail banking networks entirely. Instead, he logged directly into a high-risk, rapid-approval commercial lending portal. These predatory financial institutions catered specifically to desperate corporate entities needing immediate bridge loans, operating with minimal human oversight and relying heavily on automated credit scoring algorithms. Connor typed my name into the primary applicant field, his expensive tailored suit completely soaked in cold, terrified sweat. He was actively crossing the threshold from localized family extortion directly into major corporate identity theft. But the ticking clock of the syndicate's execution threat drowned out any remaining shred of human logic. Connor's fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard with frantic, chaotic energy. He systematically populated the extensive digital application fields using my stolen identity metrics. He leveraged my 40 years of flawless, debt-free credit history to immediately bypass the portal's initial risk assessment protocols. The automated system instantly verified the pristine nature of my commercial background and presented a maximum available credit limit. Connor did not hesitate. He aggressively requested a $500,000 immediate cash disbursement. He selected a rapid wire transfer option, routing the requested funds directly into a secondary, heavily obfuscated offshore shell account he controlled. The lending portal required a final legally binding electronic signature to authorize the massive transfer of wealth. Connor opened a separate graphic design application and imported a scanned image of my actual signature lifted directly from an old, discarded holiday greeting card Tanya had saved. He meticulously traced the ink strokes using his digital stylus, creating a perfectly rendered vector-based forgery. He embedded the fabricated signature directly into the final authorization block of the commercial loan agreement. He checked the destination routing numbers one last time, his breathing shallow and rapid. He was actively attempting to steal $500,000 against my unblemished name to save his own miserable life. He firmly clicked the final submission button. The screen displayed a spinning loading icon as the fraudulent application entered the automated underwriting queue. Connor leaned back in his expensive leather office chair, staring unblinkingly at the glowing monitor. He prayed to a god he did not believe in that the predatory algorithm would value speed over deep scrutiny. He believed his digital forgery was absolutely flawless, completely unaware that his every keystroke was already echoing inside a much larger, infinitely more sophisticated snare. 40 miles away in the secure, heavily fortified basement of his private residence, Grover sat surrounded by a glowing wall of high-resolution monitors. His forensic accounting software was not merely observing Connor's bank accounts. It was actively tethered to my entire financial identity. Grover had spent the last 3 days weaving a dense, invisible web of digital tripwires across every major credit bureau and commercial lending database in North America. The exact second Connor clicked the submission button on his stolen laptop, Grover's primary terminal erupted in a cascade of flashing crimson alerts. A high-priority alarm siren pulsed softly through the basement speakers. Grover immediately isolated the incoming data packet and intercepted the routing metadata before the automated commercial lender could even begin processing the electronic signature. He analyzed the fraudulent $500,000 request, tracing the destination IP address directly back to Connor's heavily fortified suburban home network. Grover picked up his encrypted cellular phone and dialed my number immediately. I answered on the first ring, sitting quietly at my kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee, staring out at the dark, silent street. Grover's voice was crisp, professional, and entirely devoid of panic. He rapidly briefed me on the exact nature of the cyber breach. He explained the size of the requested loan, the predatory nature of the lending portal, and the offshore destination account Connor had selected. Grover informed me that he had successfully quarantined the transaction in a digital holding pattern. He asked for my final authorization. He could instantly sever the connection, block the fraudulent application, and protect my flawless credit rating from any potential exposure. He waited for my explicit command to crush Connor's desperate digital theft before it could materialize into actual currency. I opened my own secure laptop on the kitchen table and logged into Grover's mirrored forensic server. I watched the fraudulent transaction blinking steadily on the screen, a pulsing red indicator of my son-in-law's absolute desperation. Connor was actively attempting to weaponize my clean name to buy himself a temporary reprieve from a violent syndicate execution. Blocking the transaction would certainly protect my immediate financial standing, but it would also leave Connor's crimes relegated to the shadowy realm of attempted theft. I needed his destruction to be permanent, undeniable, and entirely visible to the highest echelons of federal law enforcement. I took a slow, measured sip of my black coffee. I instructed Grover to release the digital quarantine immediately. I ordered him to let the fraudulent loan application process completely and without any interference. Grover paused for a fraction of a second, understanding the massive legal implications of my command, but he did not question my authority. I watched the spinning indicator on my monitor shift from a warning red to a solid verified green. The predatory lending algorithm approved the fabricated signature and instantly authorized the release of $500,000. By intentionally allowing the stolen money to cross state lines and physically hit Connor's offshore shell account, I was no longer dealing with a simple family dispute over real estate. I was actively sealing Connor's fate for major federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. The digital trap snapped shut with a quiet, irreversible finality. Connor believed he had successfully stolen his temporary salvation, but he had actually just handed the federal government the exact rope they needed to hang him for the rest of his natural life. The ultimate crime was complete. Connor wasted absolutely no time putting his stolen capital to work. The digital transfer from the predatory lender cleared his offshore shell account by early Friday morning. He immediately funneled $200,000 to a syndicate lieutenant, buying himself a temporary stay of execution from the underground lenders. The remaining $300,000 did not go toward legitimate business expenses or debt consolidation. Connor funneled the cash directly into a spectacular, meticulously staged corporate illusion. He rented out the entire top floor of the most exclusive glass-walled venue in the downtown financial district for a lavish company launch party. The event was explicitly designed to dazzle high-net-worth individuals and legitimate venture capitalists. Connor needed a mechanism to launder his rapidly dwindling stolen funds, and he intended to use this gala to attract clean money to wash his dirty capital. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated through the room carrying silver trays of imported caviar and crystal flutes of vintage champagne. A string quartet played softly in the corner, masking the sound of Connor's desperate hustle. He moved through the crowd with absolute arrogance, his ruined tuxedo replaced by a brand-new custom-tailored midnight blue suit. He slapped backs, shook hands, and confidently pitched the revolutionary potential of a tech company that possessed absolutely zero actual assets. He directed his most aggressive charm toward a select group of primary investors seated at a VIP table near the floor-to-ceiling windows. Connor truly believed his manufactured reality had successfully replaced his impending doom. He thought he had outrun his syndicate debt, completely unaware that his stolen digital foundation was actively being monitored by federal authorities. Tanya floated through the glittering crowd, completely immersed in the opulent fantasy she had sacrificed her own mother to maintain. She wore a stunning, floor-length emerald gown and a heavy necklace of cascading diamonds that caught the ambient light with every step she took. She clinked champagne flutes with the wives of prominent bankers, loudly discussing summer homes and upcoming European vacations. She actively ignored the brutal reality of how this luxurious evening was being funded. Down on the ground floor, the venue's heavy glass doors slid open. I stepped into the grand marble lobby. I did not wear a tuxedo or attempt to blend in with the high society attendees. I wore my standard dark work slacks, heavy scuffed boots, and a thick, weather-beaten canvas jacket. The elite security detail stationed at the elevators immediately moved to intercept me, assessing my blue-collar appearance as a blatant security threat. I did not break my stride. I looked the lead guard directly in the eyes and maintained a cold forward momentum that physically forced him to step aside. I rode the glass elevator to the penthouse level, watching the city lights shrink beneath me. The elevator doors chimed and parted, revealing the lavishly decorated ballroom. I stepped out onto the plush carpet. The string quartet continued playing. The affluent crowd continued their oblivious chatter. I did not shout. I did not create a violent spectacle or confront my former daughter as she laughed across the room. I maintained a steady, purposeful pace, navigating through the sea of expensive suits and designer gowns. My eyes remained locked entirely on the VIP table situated by the panoramic windows. I walked directly toward Connor's primary investor, a silver-haired billionaire who held the key to my son-in-law's entire fraudulent laundering scheme. Connor was standing directly beside the silver-haired billionaire, leaning down and speaking with a confident, persuasive smile. He was actively closing the investment deal that would supposedly cement his corporate legitimacy. He did not see me approach until my heavy work boots stopped just inches from the edge of the pristine white linen tablecloth. Connor froze mid-sentence. The arrogant smile instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, sickening wave of pure terror. He opened his mouth to call for security, but the words died completely in his throat. I did not acknowledge his existence. I looked exclusively at the primary investor sitting comfortably in his leather chair. I reached inside my canvas jacket and pulled out a thick, tightly packed manila envelope. I raised my hand and dropped the heavy package directly onto the center of the VIP table. It landed with a loud, definitive slap against the wood, rattling the crystal champagne flutes. I looked the billionaire straight in the eye and advised him to deeply review his potential partner's actual portfolio. Inside that envelope rested the absolute destruction of Connor's entire life. Grover had compiled pristine time-stamped digital logs proving Connor had committed federal wire fraud to steal $500,000 just hours earlier. Beneath the financial logs sat the official medical toxicology report explicitly detailing the illegal psychotropic drugs Connor had used to chemically imprison my wife. Tucked at the very bottom were crisp, high-resolution photographs secured by the tactical extraction team. The images clearly showed Connor standing in dark parking lots, desperately negotiating with known highly violent enforcers from the underground lending syndicate. The envelope was not merely a collection of papers. It was a concentrated bomb of undeniable radioactive truth. The silver-haired investor looked from my unblinking gaze down to the heavy manila envelope resting on his table. He ignored Connor's frantic, stuttering attempts to intervene and calmly pulled the tab open. He extracted the top layer of documents, his eyes scanning the irrefutable federal wire fraud evidence. He paused, his brow furrowing, before pulling out the toxicology report and the vivid photographs of the syndicate enforcers. The healthy color completely drained from the billionaire's face, leaving him a stark, ashen white. He realized instantly that he was mere moments away from tying his clean, highly scrutinized corporate funds to a desperate criminal guilty of elder abuse, mob debt, and massive federal bank fraud. He dropped the horrific documents back onto the white linen tablecloth as if they were physically burning his fingers. He stood up slowly, pushing his heavy leather chair back. He looked at Connor with an expression of absolute, unadulterated disgust. The investor raised his hand and signaled his private legal team sitting at the adjacent table. He issued a sharp carrying command ordering his attorneys to immediately and permanently sever all financial ties, proposed contracts, and social connections with Connor's shell company. The sheer venom in the billionaire's voice cut through the ambient noise of the gala. The string quartet faltered and stopped playing entirely. A heavy, suffocating silence rapidly rippled outward from the VIP table, swallowing the entire ballroom. The surrounding elite venture capitalists and wealthy socialites turned to look at the undeniable criminal evidence scattered across the tablecloth. The collective realization hit the room like a physical shockwave. One by one, the investors silently set down their champagne flutes, turned their backs on the ruined tech entrepreneur, and began marching out of the glass doors. Connor watched the silver-haired billionaire walk away. The devastating reality of his total ruin finally shattered his carefully constructed corporate mask. The lavish penthouse ballroom was emptying rapidly, the wealthy elite fleeing from the radioactive fallout of his exposed crimes. Connor turned his head and locked eyes with me, his face contorted into a mask of absolute unhinged rage. He blamed me for the destruction of his illusion. He let out a feral, desperate shout and lunged across the pristine white carpet directly toward where I stood. He pulled his arm back, curling his hand into a tight fist, fully intending to strike the man who had just dismantled his entire life. He expected me to flinch. I did not move a single muscle. I kept my hands resting calmly inside the pockets of my canvas jacket. Connor never even closed the distance. Two men in tailored black suits seamlessly detached themselves from the scattering crowd. Grover had anticipated Connor's violent lack of emotional control and quietly embedded high-end plainclothes security specialists among the gala attendees. The guards intercepted Connor with brutal, calculated efficiency. The first man grabbed Connor's raised forearm, twisting the wrist sharply to neutralize the impending strike. The second man stepped into Connor's blind spot, driving a heavy shoulder directly into his chest. They forced him violently against a nearby marble pillar, pinning his arms high and tight behind his back. Connor struggled frantically against their iron grip, kicking his polished leather shoes against the floorboards. He spit vicious curses at me, his immaculate midnight blue suit wrinkling against the cold stone. I stood merely 3 feet away, watching his pathetic physical struggle with absolute deadpan silence. The titan of industry was reduced to a flailing, desperate animal. I stepped closer to the marble pillar, ensuring my voice would carry across the sudden heavy quiet of the half-empty ballroom. Tanya stood paralyzed near the center of the room, clutching her champagne flute, forced to witness the absolute dismantling of her husband. I spoke with a deep, resonant clarity, projecting every syllable to guarantee the remaining stragglers and my treacherous daughter heard the undeniable truth. I stated exactly how Connor had systematically drugged Brenda, utilizing illegal psychotropic tranquilizers to keep my wife chemically paralyzed in a fraudulent care facility. I watched the color drain completely from Tanya's face as I laid out the meticulous timeline of their coordinated extortion. I detailed how Connor had desperately attempted to leverage my commercial logistics empire to satisfy $3 million of underground syndicate debt. I looked directly at Connor, addressing the sheer audacity of his entitlement. I told him he had made a fatal miscalculation by attempting to steal a black man's lifetime of brutal, uncompromising labor to fund his artificial white-collar lifestyle. I had spent 40 years hauling freight bleeding on concrete loading docks and building a nationwide fleet from a single rusty engine. Connor thought he could simply print a fraudulent document, forge a digital signature, and swallow my legacy whole to save his own skin from violent loan sharks. I made it abundantly clear that my wealth was forged in sweat while his entire existence was fabricated on stolen credit and weaponized deceit. The remaining guests stared at Connor with absolute revulsion. The horrific reality of his elder abuse and chemical imprisonment completely destroyed any lingering shred of his high society reputation. I stood before him, the immovable object that had finally broken his unstoppable greed. The sharp clicking of hard leather heels against the marble floor broke the suffocating tension. The general manager of the luxury downtown venue marched directly toward Tanya. He carried a sleek black payment terminal in his right hand and wore an expression of severe, uncompromising panic. He bypassed the security struggle entirely and stepped directly into Tanya's personal space. He did not bother lowering his voice to protect her fragile social standing. He loudly informed her that the platinum credit card she had placed on file to cover the exorbitant catering, the string quartet, and the penthouse rental had just hard declined. Tanya blinked in rapid succession, shaking her head in aggressive denial. She haughtily insisted there must be a simple banking error, demanding the manager run the heavy metal card again immediately. The manager held up the terminal screen, showing her the glaring red error code spanning the digital display. He explained that he had already personally contacted the Merchant Services Department. The bank had not simply declined the transaction due to a lack of available credit. Federal law enforcement authorities had executed a sweeping, immediate freeze on every single financial account tied to Connor's corporate and personal identity. Grover's digital trap had officially triggered the federal wire fraud investigation. The government had locked down their domestic checking accounts, their offshore shell companies, and their joint credit lines simultaneously. Tanya's diamond necklace suddenly looked like a heavy, suffocating collar around her throat. The manager demanded an immediate alternative form of payment for the massive six-figure invoice they had racked up tonight. He sternly warned her that he would lock the venue doors and summon local authorities for theft of services if she did not produce valid funds within the next 5 minutes. Tanya spun around frantically, her emerald designer gown sweeping heavily against the plush carpet. Total suffocating panic finally fractured her arrogant composure. The realization that her endless stream of stolen wealth had evaporated instantly crushed her artificial reality. She looked wildly toward the marble pillar where Connor was still pinned by the security operatives. She practically screamed his name across the tense ballroom, begging him to fix the banking error and salvage their public dignity. She demanded he call his lawyers and release the frozen funds immediately. Connor stared back at her with wide, terrified eyes. He understood the lethal severity of the federal freeze better than anyone. The syndicate deadline was actively ticking down. The government was seizing his assets for wire fraud, and the private investors had completely abandoned him. His carefully constructed life was actively burning to ash. Connor did not offer his wife a single word of reassurance. He did not step forward to protect her from the furious venue management or the impending arrival of the police. He utilized a sudden, desperate surge of pure adrenaline to violently twist his shoulders, momentarily breaking the physical grip of the plainclothes guards. Connor ripped his arms free, shoving the nearest operative backward into a catering table. He did not look at Tanya again. He turned and sprinted blindly toward the rear service exit of the penthouse. He slammed his body against the heavy metal crash bar, bursting out into the cold night air and disappearing down the emergency stairwell. He abandoned his wife instantly, leaving Tanya standing completely alone in the center of the glittering ballroom to face the catastrophic financial ruins and the imminent legal fallout entirely by herself. The final severing of their toxic alliance was absolute. Connor practically tore the steering wheel from the steering column as he navigated his luxury SUV back to his sprawling suburban estate. He ignored the speed limits, completely driven by a primal, blinding fear of the syndicate's 48-hour death sentence. He slammed the heavy front door behind him, completely ignoring Tanya, who was still weeping on the living room sofa. He sprinted up the grand, sweeping staircase and locked himself inside his pristine, mahogany-paneled home office. His hands shook violently as he tore open the bottom drawer of his custom desk. Weeks ago, during his initial campaign to medically isolate Brenda, he had methodically photocopied every single piece of my sensitive personal identification. He spread the stolen documents across his immaculate desk. He possessed pristine digital copies of my driver's license, my social security card, my birth certificate, and my clean, untarnished commercial tax returns. The syndicate needed $3 million, but Connor knew he could not generate that amount of liquid cash instantly without triggering massive federal red flags. He needed an immediate, untraceable stopgap to appease the lieutenants and buy himself another week to flee the country entirely. He booted up his encrypted laptop and bypassed the standard retail banking networks entirely. Instead, he logged directly into a high-risk, rapid-approval commercial lending portal. These predatory financial institutions catered specifically to desperate corporate entities needing immediate bridge loans, operating with minimal human oversight, and relying heavily on automated credit scoring algorithms. Connor typed my name into the primary applicant field, his expensive tailored suit completely soaked in cold, terrified sweat. He was actively crossing the threshold from localized family extortion directly into major corporate identity theft. But the ticking clock of the syndicate's execution threat drowned out any remaining shred of human logic. Connor's fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard with frantic, chaotic energy. He systematically populated the extensive digital application fields using my stolen identity metrics. He leveraged my 40 years of flawless, debt-free credit history to immediately bypass the portal's initial risk assessment protocols. The automated system instantly verified the pristine nature of my commercial background. and presented a maximum available credit limit. Connor did not hesitate. He aggressively requested a $500,000 immediate cash disbursement. He selected a rapid wire transfer option, routing the requested funds directly into a secondary, heavily obfuscated offshore shell account he controlled. The lending portal required a final, legally binding electronic signature to authorize the massive transfer of wealth. Connor opened a separate graphic design application and imported a scanned image of my actual signature lifted directly from an old, discarded holiday greeting card Tanya had saved. He meticulously traced the ink strokes using his digital stylus, creating a perfectly rendered vector-based forgery. He embedded the fabricated signature directly into the final authorization block of the commercial loan agreement. He checked the destination routing numbers one last time, his breathing shallow and rapid. He was actively attempting to steal $500,000 against my unblemished name to save his own miserable life. He firmly clicked the final submission button. The screen displayed a spinning loading icon as the fraudulent application entered the automated underwriting queue. Connor leaned back in his expensive leather office chair, staring unblinkingly at the glowing monitor. He prayed to a god he did not believe in, that the predatory algorithm would value speed over deep scrutiny. He believed his digital forgery was absolutely flawless, completely unaware that his every keystroke was already echoing inside a much larger, infinitely more sophisticated snare. 40 miles away in the secure, heavily fortified basement of his private residence, Grover sat surrounded by a glowing wall of high-resolution monitors. His forensic accounting software was not merely observing Connor's bank accounts, it was actively tethered to my entire financial identity. Grover had spent the last 3 days weaving a dense, invisible web of digital tripwires across every major credit bureau and commercial lending database in North America. The exact second Connor clicked the submission button on his stolen laptop, Grover's primary terminal erupted in a cascade of flashing crimson alerts. A high-priority alarm siren pulsed softly through the basement speakers. Grover immediately isolated the incoming data packet and intercepted the routing metadata before the automated commercial lender could even begin processing the electronic signature. He analyzed the fraudulent $500,000 request, tracing the destination IP address directly back to Connor's heavily fortified suburban home network. Grover picked up his encrypted cellular phone and dialed my number immediately. I answered on the first ring, sitting quietly at my kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee staring out at the dark, silent street. Grover's voice was crisp, professional, and entirely devoid of panic. He rapidly briefed me on the exact nature of the cyber breach. He explained the size of the requested loan, the predatory nature of the lending portal, and the offshore destination account Connor had selected. Grover informed me that he had successfully quarantined the transaction in a digital holding pattern. He asked for my final authorization. He could instantly sever the connection, block the fraudulent application, and protect my flawless credit rating from any potential exposure. He waited for my explicit command to crush Connor's desperate digital theft before it could materialize into actual currency. I opened my own secure laptop on the kitchen table and logged into Grover's mirrored forensic server. I watched the fraudulent transaction blinking steadily on the screen, a pulsing red indicator of my son-in-law's absolute desperation. Connor was actively attempting to weaponize my clean name to buy himself a temporary reprieve from a violent syndicate execution. Blocking the transaction would certainly protect my immediate financial standing, but it would also leave Connor's crimes relegated to the shadowy realm of attempted theft. I needed his destruction to be permanent, undeniable, and entirely visible to the highest echelons of federal law enforcement. I took a slow, measured sip of my black coffee. I instructed Grover to release the digital quarantine immediately. I ordered him to let the fraudulent loan application process completely and without any interference. Grover paused for a fraction of a second, understanding the massive legal implications of my command, but he did not question my authority. I watched the spinning indicator on my monitor shift from a warning red to a solid verified green. The predatory lending algorithm approved the fabricated signature and instantly authorized the release of $500,000. By intentionally allowing the stolen money to cross state lines and physically hit Connor's offshore shell account, I was no longer dealing with a simple family dispute over real estate. I was actively sealing Connor's fate for major federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. The digital trap snapped shut with a quiet, irreversible finality. Connor believed he had successfully stolen his temporary salvation, but he had actually just handed the federal government the exact rope they needed to hang him for the rest of his natural life. The ultimate crime was complete. Connor sat in the center of the stark, windowless interrogation room, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing relentlessly overhead. The heavy steel door had locked behind him hours ago, leaving him alone with the suffocating reality of his sudden arrest. He slammed his handcuffed fists against the cold metal table, the sharp clang echoing off the concrete walls. He glared at the two federal agents sitting calmly across from him, his polished corporate arrogance temporarily masking his underlying terror. He demanded his high-priced defense attorney, immediately shouting that his detainment was a catastrophic violation of his civil rights. He leaned forward, attempting to leverage the authoritative tone he used to bully subordinates in the boardroom. He absolutely denied any knowledge of the $500,000 commercial wire fraud, claiming his digital identity had been compromised by sophisticated corporate rivals. He scoffed loudly at the poisoning allegations, dismissing them as the fabricated ramblings of an unstable, vindictive father-in-law. He insisted that Brenda's medical isolation was purely a private family health matter, completely insulated by his perfectly legal medical proxy. He challenged the agents to produce a single shred of actionable proof connecting him to the underground lending syndicate. Connor's chest heaved with manufactured indignation. He believed he could talk his way out of the steel room using the same aggressive manipulation tactics that had built his fraudulent empire. He assumed the federal authorities were bluffing, fishing for a confession without holding any actual leverage. He crossed his arms over his chest, jutting his chin out in a display of absolute defiance. He told the lead agent to release him immediately or face a massive career-ending civil lawsuit for false imprisonment. He still thought he controlled the narrative. The lead agent did not flinch at Connor's aggressive theatrical display. He offered a tight, completely humorless smile and slowly unclasped the thick manila envelope resting on the metal table. He reached inside and extracted a pristine stack of digital forensic reports, placing them methodically in front of Connor. The top document was a direct time-stamped transcript of the electronic commercial loan application. The agent silently slid the paperwork across the cold steel surface, tapping his index finger directly on the digitally forged signature. He calmly explained that federal cybercrimes units had tracked the exact IP address of the fraudulent submission. The digital footprint led directly past Connor's encrypted firewalls and straight to the laptop sitting on his mahogany desk in his suburban mansion. The agent detailed the mandatory federal sentencing guidelines for aggravated identity theft and major commercial wire fraud. He informed Connor that he was currently looking at a guaranteed minimum of 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary completely devoid of early parole options. The color vanished instantly from Connor's face as the crushing reality of the physical evidence destroyed his arrogant facade. He stared at the glowing timestamps and the undeniable routing numbers proving his direct involvement. The walls of the interrogation room seemed to close in around him rapidly. His corporate bravado evaporated into sheer, unfiltered panic. He realized his expensive lawyers could not negotiate their way out of a bulletproof digital paper trail. The absolute certainty of spending the next 2 decades in a concrete cell shattered his loyalty. Connor made a split-second, entirely self-serving calculation. To save his own life, he immediately shifted his strategy from aggressive denial to desperate cooperation. He threw his wife entirely under the bus without a single moment of hesitation. Connor leaned aggressively across the metal table, his voice dropping into a frantic, pleading register. He frantically assured the federal agents that he was not the criminal mastermind behind the massive extortion plot. He pointed a trembling finger at the empty air, claiming that Tanya had meticulously orchestrated the entire horrific scheme from the very beginning. He wove a desperate narrative painting himself as a manipulated victim entirely controlled by his wife's sociopathic greed. He stated with absolute conviction that Tanya harbored a deep, lifelong hatred for her mother and had personally initiated the plan to neutralize Brenda. He swore to the agents that Tanya was the one who researched the illegal psychotropic tranquilizers, covertly administering the toxic chemicals to keep the older woman chemically paralyzed and compliant. Connor claimed he was terrified of his wife's volatile temper and went along with the medical isolation purely out of fear for his own safety. He pushed the boundaries of his treachery, further attacking Tanya's character with vicious precision. He blamed the entire $500,000 wire fraud directly on her insatiable high-society shopping habits. He told the lead agent that Tanya had threatened to destroy him in divorce court if he did not secure immediate liquid cash to maintain her lavish lifestyle. He insisted she forced him to log into the commercial lending portal and utilize the stolen identity documents to appease her endless financial demands. Connor painted a vivid picture of Tanya as a ruthless, calculating monster who viewed her parents as nothing more than disposable assets. He offered to testify against her in open federal court, promising to provide detailed accounts of her continuous manipulation in exchange for full immunity and witness protection. He sold her out completely to save himself. The lead agent listened to Connor's frantic, treacherous confession without showing a single flicker of emotion. He did not take any physical notes or interrupt the desperate torrent of accusations. He simply let Connor dig his own grave, allowing the man to thoroughly detail his intimate knowledge of the chemical poisoning and the federal wire fraud while attempting to shift the blame. When Connor finally ran out of breath, his chest heaving with the exertion of his massive betrayal, a heavy, suffocating silence descended over the interrogation room. The agent leaned forward and calmly pressed the solid black button on the digital tape recorder sitting in the center of the table. A sharp click echoed off the concrete walls as the recording device powered down. The agent slowly stood up from his metal chair and adjusted his suit jacket. He did not offer Connor immunity or even acknowledge his desperate plea for witness protection. He walked purposefully toward the solid gray door positioned on the right side of the interrogation room. He grabbed the heavy steel handle and pulled the door open, revealing the dark observation room located directly adjacent to their concrete cell. The bright fluorescent lights from the interrogation space spilled into the darkened room, illuminating a single metal folding chair facing the two-way mirror. Tanya sat rigidly in the chair, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her makeup was ruined by streaks of silent tears, and her eyes were wide with absolute, unadulterated horror. She had been escorted into the building an hour earlier and seated behind the glass. She had listened to every single word of her husband's cowardly, backstabbing confession. The absolute destruction of their marriage was permanently cemented under the harsh federal lights. Tanya did not wait around the federal building to be formally charged. The absolute shock of Connor's complete betrayal propelled her out of the observation room and into the cold night. She drove frantically to the secure private medical facility where Grover had safely transferred Brenda for her specialized detox and recovery. I was sitting quietly on a padded chair in the pristine, brightly lit hallway outside my wife's room, holding a lukewarm cup of black coffee. The heavy double doors at the far end of the corridor swung open violently. Tanya sprinted toward me, her expensive emerald gown torn at the hem and her makeup completely ruined by heavy streaks of running mascara. She did not bother looking through the glass window to check on her mother's condition. She threw herself directly onto the polished linoleum floor at my feet. She grabbed my thick canvas jacket, weeping hysterically, her manicured nails digging deep into the tough fabric. She sobbed out the entire story of the interrogation room, repeating every single vicious lie Connor had eagerly fed to the federal agents. She begged me to protect her from the impending wire fraud charges and the horrifying allegations of elder abuse. She pleaded with me to use my vast corporate resources and high-priced legal connections to shield her from federal prison. She wailed that her husband had brutally manipulated her, completely abandoning her to take the fall for his massive criminal enterprise. I looked down at my daughter, my expression completely neutral and devoid of any paternal warmth. I did not reach out to comfort her or stroke her hair. I just let her cry aggressively against my boots, waiting for the inevitable shift in her performance. The frantic sobbing abruptly ceased. Tanya slowly released her iron grip on my jacket and pushed herself up off the polished hospital floor. She wiped the smeared mascara from her cheeks, her posture shifting seamlessly from a terrified victim back into a calculating opportunist. The terrified daughter completely vanished, replaced by the exact same greedy monster I had witnessed mingling at the downtown venue. She looked me directly in the eyes and initiated her final pathetic attempt at manipulation. She confidently offered to act as the primary star witness for the federal prosecution. She promised to testify in open court against Connor, swearing to provide the FBI with every encrypted password, hidden offshore account number, and unrecorded syndicate meeting she had ever witnessed. She claimed her testimony would guarantee Connor a life sentence behind federal bars. But her sudden loyalty carried a massive, uncompromising price tag. In exchange for delivering Connor to the authorities, she demanded that I immediately liquidate a portion of my commercial logistics portfolio to completely erase her astronomical credit card debt. Furthermore, she forcefully insisted I establish an irrevocable high-yield trust fund to perpetually maintain her luxury lifestyle, explicitly demanding a monthly allowance that rivaled a corporate executive's salary. She stood in the sterile hospital corridor, mere feet away from the mother she had helped chemically imprison, and brazenly attempted to extort me one last time. She crossed her arms, raising her chin with a sickening sense of entitlement, totally blind to the fact that her leverage had completely evaporated. She truly believed her testimony was the ultimate bargaining chip. She thought she still held the power to negotiate the terms of her own salvation and dictate the financial terms of our relationship. I sat completely motionless in the hospital chair, staring up at the hollow, empty shell of a human being my daughter had become. The sheer audacity of her financial demands echoed in the quiet corridor, a final unforgivable insult to the 40 years of unrelenting labor I had invested in our family. She possessed absolutely no remorse for the agonizing trauma she had inflicted upon her own mother. She only cared about securing her next massive payout to fund her designer wardrobe. I slowly stood up, towering over her, and reached deep into the interior breast pocket of my canvas jacket. I retrieved a thick, professionally bound legal document stamped with the heavy gold seal of Grover's primary law firm. It was my official, fully executed last will and testament. I held the crisp, heavy paper up to the harsh, fluorescent lights, ensuring Tanya could clearly read the bold, capitalized letters spanning the cover page. This document represented the entirety of my logistics empire, every warehouse deed, every commercial shipping contract, and the accumulated millions I had intended to pass down to my only child. I looked her dead in the eye, my face a mask of absolute unforgiving granite. Without breaking eye contact, I gripped the heavy binding and violently ripped the entire legal document perfectly in half. Tanya let out a sharp, involuntary gasp, her hands reaching out reflexively to stop me. I ignored her completely. I tore the thick halves again, reducing the multi-million-dollar inheritance into meaningless shreds of worthless paper. I let the torn pieces flutter out of my hands, showering down onto the linoleum floor, right over the scuff marks her expensive shoes had made. The generational wealth she had spent months trying to steal evaporated right in front of her face. Tanya stared at the shredded remnants of my will, her mouth opening and closing in absolute paralyzing shock. I stepped directly over the ruined paper, closing the distance between us until she was forced to look up at my face. I delivered my final, non-negotiable terms with a voice as cold as absolute zero. I informed her that I would pay a standard retainer for a basic entry-level defense attorney to navigate her federal fraud charges. I would ensure she received adequate legal representation to keep her out of a maximum security penitentiary purely out of basic respect for the memory of the innocent child she used to be. Beyond that singular concession, she would receive absolutely nothing from me ever again. There would be no luxury trust funds, no cleared credit card debts, no commercial real estate transfers, and zero future contact with Brenda or myself. I explicitly stated that she was entirely permanently cut off from the family fortune. She would have to find a minimum wage job, rent a modest apartment, and learn to survive in the brutal reality she had always looked down upon. I turned my back on her and placed my hand on the heavy metal handle of Brenda's hospital room door. Tanya finally processed the catastrophic finality of my words. Her legs gave out completely. She collapsed back onto the cold hospital floor, letting out a hollow, agonizing wail that echoed endlessly down the empty corridor. The artificial empire she had built on manipulation and deceit had finally shattered into dust. She realized with crushing, inescapable clarity that she had permanently lost her family, her stolen wealth, and her entire future. I pushed the door open and walked inside to sit with my wife, leaving Tanya to drown in the absolute ruins of her own making. The crisp morning air carried a deceptive tranquility over the manicured lawns of the affluent suburban neighborhood. That fragile peace shattered completely at exactly 7 o'clock when a convoy of dark, heavy vehicles turned onto the pristine street. 5 armored SUVs, flanked by 2 marked local police cruisers, rolled to a synchronized halt directly in front of Connor and Tanya's sprawling luxury estate. The heavy doors swung open simultaneously, dispensing a coordinated team of federal marshals wearing tactical vests emblazoned with bold yellow lettering. They did not knock politely or wait for an invitation. The lead marshal marched up the sweeping brick walkway and drove a heavy fist against the custom oak front door, his booming voice demanding immediate entry under federal authority. 2 other agents flanked the perimeter, securing all possible exit routes. They carried thick stacks of legal documentation, the irrefutable paperwork authorized by a federal judge executing a total asset freeze. The marshals systematically taped bright, unavoidable eviction and seizure notices directly across the expensive stained glass of the front entryway. The sprawling mansion, purchased entirely with phantom capital and sustained by chemical extortion, was officially confiscated. Every piece of custom furniture, every imported vehicle in the driveway, and the physical structure itself were now property of the United States government as material evidence in an ongoing wire fraud investigation. The illusion of Connor's impenetrable wealth was physically dismantled piece by piece in the stark morning light. The heavy wooden door finally swung open, revealing the absolute ruins of a man who had attempted to build an empire on the back of his stolen father-in-law's legacy. The federal agents breached the threshold with overwhelming force, officially ending Connor's fraudulent reign of terror. Connor emerged from the grand entryway a few minutes later, his physical appearance a grotesque parody of his former polished arrogance. He wore the same wrinkled, sweat-stained shirt from the night of his failed escape attempt. Heavy steel handcuffs bit deeply into his wrists, pinning his arms rigidly behind his back. Two burly federal marshals gripped his biceps forcefully, marching him down the brick walkway toward the waiting transport vehicle. The harsh morning sun illuminated his pale, terrified face, exposing the dark, exhausted circles beneath his wide eyes. The flashing blue and red lights of the police cruisers cast a chaotic, unforgiving strobe across the manicured lawns, drawing the undivided attention of the entire effluent street. Front doors opened cautiously. Neighbors stepped out onto their pristine porches in their plush bathrobes, holding coffee mugs as they witnessed the spectacular public destruction of the neighborhood's most arrogant resident. Stan, the older gentleman who lived directly across the street, stood firmly on the edge of his perfectly cut grass. He did not possess a shred of sympathy for the disgraced tech entrepreneur. Stan crossed his arms tightly over his chest, his jaw set in a rigid line of absolute, uncompromising contempt. He watched the federal agents shove Connor toward the armored SUV, his eyes burning with silent judgment. Connor had spent years looking down on his neighbors, treating them as inferior background characters in his artificial story of success. Now he was forced to endure the agonizing walk of shame under their collective disgusted scrutiny. His expensive leather shoes scuffed against the concrete pavement as his legs buckled slightly under the sheer weight of his public humiliation. The neighborhood watched in total silence as the predator was finally caged. The federal marshals shoved Connor roughly into the rear seat of the armored vehicle, slamming the heavy steel door shut behind him. The engine roared to life, a deep mechanical growl that signaled the absolute end of his freedom. The convoy shifted into drive, pulling away from the seized estate and rolling slowly down the quiet suburban street. As the heavy cruiser navigated the turn at the end of the block, an unmoving figure stood firmly on the corner sidewalk. I did not hide in the shadows or watch from a distance. I stood openly in the crisp morning air, wearing my heavy canvas work jacket, holding a steaming cup of dark roast coffee. I planted my boots squarely on the concrete, projecting an aura of absolute, unbreakable calm. I did not smile as the flashing lights washed over my face. I did not offer a petty smirk or a triumphant gesture. I merely watched the procession of federal vehicles approach my posture, radiating the quiet satisfaction of completely restored order. The intricate, flawless trap I had set had executed its final lethal function perfectly. Connor's entire life was officially dismantled not by violence but by the irrefutable weight of his own calculated greed. I had not laid a single hand on him yet. I had utterly destroyed his fraudulent empire, stripped him of his stolen assets, and secured a concrete cell for his immediate future. The quiet neighborhood provided the perfect backdrop for this silent adjustment of power. I took a slow, methodical breath, feeling the chilling morning breeze against my skin. The predator was successfully removed from my family's ecosystem. I remained completely still, a stoic monument to endurance, waiting patiently for the police cruiser to pass directly in front of my position. Connor sat trapped behind the reinforced steel mesh of the federal cruiser, his chest heaving with frantic, suffocating breaths. As the vehicle rolled toward the intersection, his wide, panicked eyes locked onto my unmoving figure standing on the corner. The sheer sight of my calm, unapologetic presence shattered his final thread of psychological control. Connor lunged forward against his restraints, violently slamming his face and shoulders against the thick, bulletproof glass of the rear window. He thrashed like a rabid-cornered animal, his mouth contorting into vicious, spit-flecked snarls. The heavy acoustic glass completely muted his frantic screams, turning his desperate rage into a pathetic, silent pantomime. He hurled vile curses, violently kicking the steel doors, utterly consumed by the realization that I was the architect of his total annihilation. He expected me to react to his fury, demanding a final confrontation to validate his shattered ego. I did not give him the satisfaction of a single word. I looked directly into his terrified, unhinged eyes for one brief, profound second. I raised my ceramic mug to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The dark roast was incredibly bitter and perfectly hot. Without rushing, I lowered the cup, turned my back on the passing convoy, and began walking slowly in the opposite direction. I did not look over my shoulder as the heavy vehicles accelerated toward the federal processing facility. That simple, uncompromising gesture of absolute indifference destroyed Connor completely. The utter silence of my departure cut far deeper than any shouted insult or physical blow ever could. He was finally erased from my world, leaving him alone to rot inside the steel cage he had built with his own 2 hands. The federal justice system moved with a swift mechanical efficiency that left Connor absolutely no room to breathe or maneuver. The trial commenced just weeks after the morning raid, accelerating rapidly under the crushing weight of the prosecution's insurmountable evidence. The government did not need to rely on circumstantial narratives or emotional appeals. They built their case entirely on hard, irrefutable data. Grover took the witness stand on the second day wearing a pristine, tailored suit that mirrored his cold, analytical precision. He methodically walked the jury through the complex digital footprint of the commercial wire fraud. He displayed the exact IP addresses, the encrypted routing numbers, and the precise keystroke timestamps that proved Connor had personally executed the $500,000 theft from his secure home network. Grover's testimony dismantled Connor's defense in under an hour, transforming the tech entrepreneur's fabricated alibis into easily disprovable lies. The prosecution then pivoted directly to the horrifying reality of the elder abuse. A panel of top-tier medical experts and toxicologists took the stand in rapid succession. They presented Brenda's comprehensive blood panels explicitly detailing the dangerous, illegal concentrations of psychotropic tranquilizers Connor had systematically authorized. The lead toxicologist explained how the specific chemical cocktail was designed not to treat any legitimate medical condition, but to induce a state of permanent compliant paralysis. The jury watched in absolute silence as the charts and graphs illustrated the methodical poisoning of an innocent woman. Connor sat at the defense table, his expensive suit hanging loosely on his thinning frame, completely unable to meet the horrified gaze of the jury box. The sheer volume of forensic and digital proof constructed a bulletproof cage around him, trapping him perfectly before the defense even had an opportunity to present their opening arguments. The prosecution delivered their absolute fatal blow by calling Tanya to the witness stand. She walked across the federal courtroom with her head bowed, stripped of her emerald gowns and diamond necklaces, wearing a plain, unbranded gray suit purchased specifically for the trial. Desperate to avoid the massive federal prison sentence hanging over her own head, Tanya had completely accepted the government's plea deal. She sat before the microphone and systematically dismantled every remaining shred of her husband's life. She detailed the exact timeline of Connor's failing corporate operations, exposing how his massive tech empire was actually a hollow shell actively hemorrhaging capital. She openly admitted to his crippling underground syndicate debts, explaining how the terrifying physical threats from loan sharks had driven him into a state of absolute reckless desperation. Tanya did not attempt to protect him or minimize his actions. She outlined his specific, calculated plan to completely hijack my nationwide logistics empire to satisfy the $3 million extortion demand. She testified that Connor had explicitly targeted my clean, unblemished commercial credit rating to secure the fraudulent bridge loans, fully intending to leave me bankrupt and destroyed while he fled the country. She coldly narrated his brutal strategy to chemically isolate Brenda, removing my primary emotional anchor so he could manipulate our family assets without interference. Connor stared at her from the defense table, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked ready to fracture. He watched the woman he had partnered with for years enthusiastically serve him to the federal prosecutors on a silver platter. Tanya's testimony provided the crucial, undeniable motive that perfectly connected Grover's digital evidence with the toxicological reports, creating a comprehensive narrative of absolute greed and sociopathic entitlement. She left nothing to the imagination, ensuring the jury understood Connor's true nature. Connor's high-priced defense attorney attempted a desperate, aggressive cross-examination, but the effort crumbled instantly against the overwhelming wall of factual evidence. He could not argue with digital timestamps, blood toxicology reports, or the damning, highly detailed testimony of Connor's own wife. The defense rested their case after only 2 days, effectively surrendering to the inevitable outcome. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning to the courtroom with a unanimous, uncompromising decision. The federal judge, a stern man with zero tolerance for white-collar predators, ordered Connor to stand and face the court. The foreman read the verdict with absolute clarity, finding Connor guilty on all counts of aggravated identity theft, major commercial wire fraud, and severe elder abuse. The judge did not mince words during the sentencing phase. He looked down from the bench and addressed Connor's sheer unadulterated greed, condemning him for weaponizing his family and attempting to destroy a legitimate business to cover his own illegal gambling and syndicate debts. With a sharp, resonant strike of his wooden gavel, the judge handed down the absolute maximum penalty allowable by law. Connor was officially sentenced to 20 straight years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The judge explicitly mandated that the sentence would be served entirely without the possibility of early parole or conditional release. The heavy thud of the gavel echoed through the silent courtroom, physically extinguishing the very last ember of Connor's corporate arrogance. His shoulders slumped forward, his chest hollowing out as the devastating reality of his lost decades finally crushed his spirit. Federal marshals immediately stepped forward, clamping heavy iron cuffs around his wrists. He was forcefully marched out of the courtroom, permanently removed from society, reduced to a mere federal inmate number. Tanya remained seated at the prosecution's table, trembling as she awaited her own judicial fate. Because of her extensive cooperation and her willingness to completely destroy her husband's defense, the government honored their highly restrictive plea agreement. The judge addressed her next, his tone dripping with profound disgust for her complicity and sheer moral bankruptcy. He spared her from a federal prison cell, but he entirely dismantled her remaining reality. Tanya was sentenced to 3 grueling years of highly monitored federal probation coupled with thousands of hours of mandatory intensive community service. The judge then delivered the final crippling financial blow. He legally ordered her to personally repay the massive 6-figure credit card debts she had recklessly accumulated during her years of artificial luxury. She was legally stripped of all marital assets, which were actively being seized and liquidated to compensate the defrauded commercial lenders. The judge made it absolutely clear that failure to maintain her strict repayment schedule or her probation terms would result in her immediate incarceration. The gavel struck one final time, officially concluding the proceedings. Tanya slowly stood up from the heavy wooden table, her entire world reduced to ash. She walked out of the towering federal courthouse completely alone. There were no sleek black luxury vehicles waiting for her at the curb. There were no expensive lawyers to guide her through the reporters, and no family left to offer her a single shred of comfort. I had secured Brenda's safety and protected my hard-earned legacy. Tanya stepped out onto the cold concrete pavement, possessing absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back and a mountain of inescapable debt, forced to finally face the brutal, uncompromising reality of the real world entirely by herself. Hollis walked through the quiet corridors of the secure medical facility, the heavy burden of the federal courtroom still resting squarely on his broad shoulders. He pushed open the heavy wooden door to Brenda's private suite and stopped dead in his tracks. For the first time in over a month, his wife was sitting upright against the pillows, her eyes bright and sharply focused. The chemical fog Connor and Tanya had systematically pumped into her veins was entirely flushed from her system. The vibrant, intelligent woman he had loved for 4 decades had finally returned from the darkness. Brenda offered a weak but genuine smile as he crossed the room and pulled a chair to her bedside. He took her frail hands in his calloused ones, feeling the familiar warmth that had anchored him through the recent storm. She asked him directly what had happened, her voice raspy but steady, stripped of the manufactured confusion that had previously plagued her. Hollis did not spare her the brutal reality. He methodically recounted every single event of the past month. He detailed Connor's desperate underground syndicate debts, the forged medical proxies, and the calculated chemical imprisonment they had subjected her to. He explained the fraudulent $500,000 wire transfer, the subsequent federal raid, and the swift, uncompromising trial that had just concluded downtown. He told her about Connor's 20-year maximum security sentence and Tanya's utter financial ruin. He spoke with a quiet, measured cadence, refusing to sugarcoat the absolute depravity of their only child. He watched Brenda absorb the devastating magnitude of the betrayal, giving her the unvarnished truth she deserved after weeks of severe psychological and physical torment. Brenda listened to the comprehensive destruction of their family unit in absolute silence. When Hollis finished speaking, heavy tears spilled over her cheeks, cutting silent paths down her face. She mourned the definitive death of the daughter they had raised, weeping for the greedy, soulless stranger Tanya had willingly become over the years. The agonizing realization that her own flesh and blood had actively participated in her chemical captivity was a wound that would never fully heal. Hollis reached out to wipe the tears from her face, his heart aching at the profound sorrow inflicted upon his wife. However, the momentary display of grief did not consume her. Brenda possessed the same core of unyielding iron that had built their commercial logistics empire from absolutely nothing. She tightened her grip on Hollis's hand, her tear-filled eyes locking onto his with absolute conviction. She told him in a voice completely devoid of hesitation that he had done the exact right thing by severing Tanya from their legacy. There was no room for misplaced maternal guilt or dangerous second chances. Brenda acknowledged that shielding a predator from the consequences of their actions only bred further destruction. She refused to spend the twilight of her life looking over her shoulder, wondering if her own daughter was plotting another lethal extortion scheme. They had sacrificed their entire youth to build a stable, prosperous existence, and Brenda forcefully stated that they would actively protect their hard-earned peace in their final years. She validated Hollis's ruthless defensive strategy, cementing their united front. The toxic element had been permanently excised from their lives, and Brenda was ready to move forward, scarred but entirely unbroken. Miles away on the bleak industrial outskirts of the city, Tanya carried a single cardboard box up 3 flights of cracked, uneven concrete stairs. She unlocked the door to a cramped, dimly lit studio apartment, the only shelter she could secure with her completely destroyed credit and frozen assets. The air inside smelled of stale cigarette smoke and damp rot, a jarring, sickening contrast to the sprawling suburban mansion she had lost mere hours ago. She set the box on the stained linoleum counter, shivering in the cold, unheated room. Her designer clothes were gone, seized by federal authorities to compensate her massive victims. She possessed exactly $40 in cash and a mountain of court-mandated restitution. The sudden, violent pounding on her cheap wooden door made her jump. Tanya approached cautiously, peering through the scratched peephole. 3 massive men in dark leather jackets stood in the narrow hallway, their physical presence radiating immediate, lethal violence. Before she could back away, the lead enforcer drove a heavy boot directly into the lock, shattering the doorframe and splintering the cheap wood. The men pushed into the tiny apartment, trapping Tanya against the kitchen counter. They were the underground syndicate debt collectors Connor had desperately tried to pay off with the fraudulent commercial loans. The lead enforcer grabbed Tanya by the throat, pinning her against the cabinetry. He did not care that Connor was currently sitting in a federal penitentiary. He calmly informed her that a $3 million debt did not simply evaporate because her husband went to prison. She was Connor's wife, and by syndicate rules, she inherited the remaining balance. He gave her exactly 48 hours to produce the millions Connor owed, or they would return to extract the payment in blood. The enforcers dropped Tanya to the floor and exited the apartment, leaving the shattered door hanging off its hinges. Tanya scrambled across the dirty linoleum, her hands shaking violently as she grabbed her cheap prepaid cell phone. Total, suffocating terror consumed her entirely. She knew the syndicate would execute her without a second thought when she failed to produce the $3 million. She dialed Hollis's private number, praying he had not blocked her completely. Hollis answered on the 3rd ring, sitting in the quiet, sterile hospital cafeteria. Tanya screamed into the receiver, her voice shrill and fractured with absolute panic. She babbled hysterically about the mobsters, the broken door, and the looming death sentence Connor had left at her feet. She begged her father to leverage his massive wealth one final time, pleading with him to pay off the underground enforcers to save her life. Hollis listened to her frantic, desperate sobbing with a cold, detached silence. He recognized the lethal reality of the syndicate threat, knowing the violent men would undoubtedly return to finish the job. He interrupted her hysterical begging with a voice as hard as forged steel. He told Tanya that he would immediately contact his corporate security specialists and financially neutralize the syndicate debt strictly to prevent her murder. He would ensure the enforcers never looked in her direction again. However, he delivered his final, absolute condition. He stated that this transaction was the definitive end of their existence to one another. He instructed her to never call Wright or approach them for the rest of her natural life. Before Tanya could offer a single word of gratitude or protest, Hollis terminated the call, permanently erasing his daughter from his world and leaving her to face her bleak, impoverished future entirely alone. Hollis ended the call with Tanya and immediately dialed Grover. He needed a direct line to the underground syndicate holding Connor's massive debt. Grover utilized his highly encrypted digital network to bypass the street-level enforcers and reach the absolute top of the criminal hierarchy. The meeting was explicitly set for midnight at an abandoned maritime shipping facility on the desolate edge of the industrial district. This was Hollis's territory. He arrived precisely on time, driving his heavy black utility vehicle through the rusted gates. He cut the engine and stepped out into the freezing night air. He did not wear a tailored corporate suit or a silk tie. He wore his heavy canvas work jacket, thick denim, and steel-toed boots. He looked exactly like the seasoned, uncompromising logistics titan who had conquered the nationwide freight industry with his bare hands. 4 massive, heavily armed men emerged from the dark shadows of the shipping containers. They fanned out rapidly, creating a secure perimeter around a single metal table, illuminated by the harsh glare of a portable halogen lamp. The head enforcer sat behind the table smoking a cigar, his posture relaxed. He expected a terrified, weak father desperately pleading for his daughter's life. Instead, Hollis walked forward with absolute, heavy, immovable confidence. He did not flinch when the armed guards roughly patted him down for concealed weapons. He locked eyes with the syndicate boss and pulled out a single metal folding chair. He sat down opposite the criminal leader, completely ignoring the visible firearms surrounding him. He leaned forward, placing his calloused hands flat on the cold metal surface. The air cracked with tension, but Hollis radiated pure lethal authority. He was not there to beg, he was there to conduct a strictly commercial transaction. Hollis reached into the deep inner pocket of his canvas jacket and extracted a sleek titanium-encased thumb drive. He placed it deliberately in the dead center of the metal table. The head enforcer stared at the small device, his expression hardening into suspicion. Hollis explained exactly what the drive contained. Before Connor's spectacular federal arrest, the fraudulent entrepreneur had desperately attempted to squirrel away massive amounts of stolen capital. Grover's forensic software had systematically tracked Connor's digital footprint, completely bypassing his pathetic security firewalls. Grover had successfully located a series of deeply buried, highly encrypted offshore cryptocurrency wallets that Connor had hidden entirely from the syndicate. Hollis leaned forward, his voice a low, resonant rumble echoing across the shipping yard. He informed the enforcer that the drive held the master seed phrases and routing algorithms required to instantly drain those hidden accounts. He explicitly stated that the digital ledger contained a specific directory for verification, instructing the enforcer's hackers to reference the exact files named Kichbanongdaden2 _24.docx and Kichbanongdaden 1 _24.docx to access the primary decryption keys. Hollis made it abundantly clear that the liquid assets locked inside those offshore wallets totaled well over $4 million. The funds were completely untraceable, entirely decentralized, and more than sufficient to cover the $3 million debt Connor owed, plus a generous margin for the inconvenience. The enforcer's eyes narrowed as he evaluated the offer. He understood the profound value of clean, untraceable digital currency. Hollis was offering him a direct, risk-free payout that completely bypassed the messy, violent process of extorting a bankrupt, hysterical woman. The titanium drive sat under the harsh halogen light, representing a bloodless, highly profitable resolution to their mutual problem. Hollis did not push the drive across the table. He kept his heavy, calloused hand firmly planted near the titanium device, asserting his absolute control over the final negotiation. He locked eyes with the syndicate boss and issued his final, non-negotiable ultimatum. The terms were brutally simple. The syndicate could take the drive, liquidate the offshore cryptocurrency accounts, and absorb the massive surplus capital. In exchange, every single debt, grievance, and violent intention attached to Connor was permanently erased. Hollis explicitly mandated that Tanya Brenda and his entire extended logistics enterprise were completely off-limits. The enforcers were never to approach Tanya's rundown apartment again. They were never to contact her, threaten her, or breathe her name in the streets. The syndicate had to formally sever all ties and permanently delete his family from their radar. If a single mobster ever stepped foot near his wife or his daughter again, Hollis promised he would unleash Grover's full digital arsenal to completely dismantle the syndicate's international money laundering operations. He swore he would burn their entire financial infrastructure to the ground. The head enforcer studied Hollis's face in the cold industrial silence. He recognized the immovable iron in the older man's intense gaze. He understood that Hollis was entirely capable of executing his threat with devastating precision. The criminal boss let out a slow, calculated breath and nodded his head once. He reached out and slid the titanium drive across the metal table, silently accepting the terms of the trade. The debt was officially settled. The contract of violence was permanently voided. Hollis stood up slowly from the folding chair. He did not offer a handshake or a parting word. He simply turned his back on the armed guards and walked away. Hollis walked back to his heavy utility vehicle without a single backward glance. He opened the heavy steel door, climbed into the driver's seat, and slammed it shut, sealing himself inside the quiet cabin. He let out a long, heavy breath, watching his breath fog the cold windshield. The massive burden of the syndicate threat had been completely neutralized. He had paid the ransom not out of love for the greedy daughter who had betrayed him, but to permanently sever the final decaying thread tying his family to Connor's criminal underworld. He reached into his pocket and retrieved his cell phone. The screen illuminated the dark cabin, showing 11 new frantic missed calls and dozens of desperate text messages from Tanya. She was still weeping, begging for an update, completely paralyzed by the fear of the enforcers returning to her door. Hollis did not read a single message. He did not call her back to offer reassurance or to confirm that her life had been spared. He opened his contact list and scrolled directly to her name. With a steady, uncompromising motion, he pressed the block button. He wiped her digital footprint from his device instantly. The very next morning, he contacted his cellular provider and ordered a complete termination of his current account. He changed his personal phone number, permanently distributing the new digits only to Grover Brenda and his most trusted logistics commanders. Tanya was left entirely in the dark. She would never receive the comforting closure of knowing she was secure. She would spend the rest of her life wondering, waiting, and completely isolated from the empire she had attempted to steal. The severance was absolute, an impenetrable boundary drawn in stone. Exactly 365 days passed since the federal gavel fell, transforming the chaotic ruins of Connor and Tanya's deceit into a distant, faded memory. The seasons changed, shifting the landscape from a bitter winter into a vibrant, promising spring, and the logistics empire I had built from the ground up continued to operate with flawless, mechanical efficiency. I had formally transferred the absolute control of every commercial shipping contract, every heavy freight vehicle, and every sprawling warehouse facility directly into the impenetrable fortress of an irrevocable blind trust. Grover's elite cadre of financial administrators managed the daily operations with surgical precision, completely insulating the massive corporate entity from any future familial claims or external predatory attacks. The immense wealth generated by a lifetime of brutal, uncompromising labor multiplied silently in secure offshore accounts and diversified commercial investments. Brenda and I did not upgrade to a sprawling luxury estate or purchase imported European vehicles to broadcast our victory. We deliberately chose the exact opposite path. We sold the large family home tainted by Tanya's greed and relocated to a modest, quiet suburban neighborhood located on the unassuming edge of the city. We purchased a comfortable single-story brick house with a wraparound porch and a small piece of land. Our existence became an exercise in intentional, absolute invisibility. I traded my tailored executive suits for comfortable canvas work jackets and reliable steel-toed boots. Brenda traded the suffocating pressures of high society expectations for the simple, profound joy of tending to her backyard garden. The neighbors saw us merely as an ordinary retired black couple living on a fixed pension, entirely unaware that the quiet man watering the front lawn commanded a nationwide financial empire. We possessed absolute power, but we chose the quiet dignity of absolute peace. On the opposite side of the sprawling city, nestled deep within a decaying commercial strip mall, the harsh reality of federal restitution extracted its daily agonizing toll. Tanya stood under the flickering, aggressively bright fluorescent lights of a high-volume fast food franchise, wearing a stiff, heavily stained polyester uniform that smelled permanently of stale frying oil and industrial bleach. Her manicured nails were gone, replaced by calloused, raw hands gripping the splintered wooden handle of a heavy industrial mop. She forcefully pushed the soapy water across the cracked linoleum floor, cleaning up the spilled sodas and discarded wrappers left behind by apathetic customers. Tanya was actively working her 14th consecutive double shift of the month, entirely trapped in a cycle of brutal minimum wage labor dictated by her strict federal probation terms. Every single paycheck she earned was immediately garnished, siphoned directly into a government escrow account to satisfy the massive six-figure credit card debt she had recklessly accumulated during her era of stolen luxury. The physical exhaustion radiated deep into her bones, stripping away the last remaining layers of her manufactured corporate arrogance. She paused near the front entrance, her aching shoulders slumping forward as she leaned heavily against the wooden mop handle to catch her breath. She wiped a line of cold sweat from her forehead and stared blankly out through the large, grease-smudged plate glass window toward the busy intersection. The heavy afternoon traffic rolled past in a blur of gray exhaust. As the traffic light shifted to a solid, vibrant red, a meticulously maintained heavy-duty black utility truck rolled to a smooth, controlled stop directly in front of the restaurant. Tanya blinked rapidly, her breath catching sharply in her throat as she instantly recognized the vehicle and the uncompromising man sitting behind the steering wheel. I sat calmly in the driver's seat of my utility truck, my hands resting lightly on the leather steering wheel as the engine idled with a deep, steady rhythm. I turned my head slightly, my gaze drifting across the crowded sidewalk, and locked eyes with the exhausted woman standing behind the stained glass of the fast food franchise. Tanya dropped her mop entirely, the heavy wooden handle clattering loudly against the linoleum floor. She took a desperate, hesitant step forward, pressing her raw palms flat against the cold pane of glass. She raised a trembling hand, her lips parting as if she were trying to speak my name through the thick, impenetrable barrier. I looked directly into her wide, panicked eyes. I did not frown in anger, nor did I offer a fleeting smile of vindictive satisfaction. My expression remained entirely neutral, a mask of unyielding, absolute stone. I felt absolutely nothing. The frantic, pleading woman in the greasy uniform was a complete stranger to me. I had mourned the death of my daughter months ago in the sterile corridor of a private medical facility. As the traffic signal snapped to a bright, vivid green, I smoothly shifted the truck into gear. I turned my head away, breaking the visual connection permanently, and drove forward into the steady flow of afternoon traffic without looking back in the rearview mirror. Tanya stood paralyzed against the glass, watching the black truck disappear down the long urban avenue. The devastating clarity of the moment finally crushed her remaining spirit. She realized with suffocating certainty that the true punishment was not the federal probation or the grueling physical labor. The ultimate inescapable sentence was the permanent, irreversible erasure of the father she had so arrogantly exploited and destroyed. I guided the truck onto the quiet, tree-lined street of our modest suburban neighborhood, steering into the concrete driveway and cutting the engine. The afternoon sun cast long, peaceful shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked up the brick pathway toward the wraparound porch. Brenda was standing near the wooden trellis, wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat and gardening gloves, meticulously pruning her vibrant red roses. She turned her head as I approached, her eyes bright and completely lucid, radiating the profound warmth that had anchored my soul for 4 decades. I leaned down and kissed her cheek gently, breathing in the scent of fresh earth and blooming flowers. I walked to the edge of the porch and leaned against the wooden railing, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic mug of coffee Brenda had left waiting for me. I looked out over the quiet street, reflecting on the absolute destruction of the predators who had attempted to consume us. Connor and Tanya were arrogant, entitled fools who genuinely believed they could easily crush an old black man through a sophisticated combination of legal tricks, chemical extortion, and white-collar deception. They had fatally underestimated the immovable foundation of a man who had survived a lifetime of systemic adversity. They failed to realize that true, insurmountable power did not reside in loud threats, expensive designer suits, or fabricated corporate titles. True power lay in silent, ruthless calculation and the unwavering patience to execute a flawless, devastating strategy. I took a slow, deep sip of the dark, bitter coffee, feeling the warm liquid settle in my chest. The toxic elements had been meticulously eradicated from our ecosystem. Absolute order was flawlessly restored, and our hard-earned peace was finally irreversibly permanent. True power does not shout from the rooftops or demand validation through endless displays of unearned wealth. It operates in silence, anchored by unyielding boundaries and the discipline to protect one's own inner peace. Family is meant to be a sanctuary, but when blood ties become a weapon for exploitation, severance is not a cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. Forgiveness does not require offering the betrayer another opportunity to strike. Reclaiming your life demands walking away from toxic relationships, entirely ensuring your legacy and dignity remain completely intact, shielded forever from any future greed or malicious deception. If you found this story compelling and want to follow along with more deeply layered narratives, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts in the comments below on how Hollis and Brenda handled the ultimate betrayal